Okay, so I guess we're going to get up and on our way. Alexandra is going to be letting some people in from the waiting room as we kind of go along. I am your host, along with Alexandra from LEPS, the Langley Environmental Partner Society. We're very happy to put on this webinar series for our Langley Seedy Saturday. We will be having various amounts of people coming in and out of the next 4-hour session, just depending on what topic they want to tune into. We are being recorded, and we just want to welcome. It's 9 a.m. here on the West Coast, and it is a great morning so far because the rain has stopped. Anyway, so Langley Seedy Saturday weekend will be concluding happily, finally, at 1 p.m. today, and we're very happy to put on this event for Langley and surrounding areas. And this is always what happens in Zoom. Here we go. So today's webinars are brought to you essentially by the Langley Environmental Partner Society. We are the ones that's provided the link, and we have one presenter from LEPS presenting today at noon. But a majority of our speakers are affiliated with Seeds of Diversity, so we want to give an extra shout out to them. We really appreciate their support during COVID and setting up Seedy Saturday and Sunday events across Canada. I didn't put on here also Farm Folk, City Folk. They've been very instrumental as well. But we will be again recording this session, and we're going to be putting it up on our YouTube channel for LEPS, and also sharing it with Seeds of Diversity. So we just have a little bit of Zoom etiquette and general information. So no matter what, you should be actually having your video screen off and you're muted upon entry. But we just want to make sure that however things happen in the world of technology during COVID, as we all learn it, that you make sure that your volume is at least set to mute throughout this period. Again, the video should remain off because we are recording, and having multiple videos can be very distracting to people. And all of our presentations are about an average of 45 minutes. And after each presenter, we'll be having a Q&A live with them. For a maximum of 15 minutes. So you can type in the chat, absolutely, that's what Alexandra is here for. She'll be notating all of the things that you might have some questions, and also you will be able to unmute yourself to ask live questions after the presentation is over. But this is a long 4 hours. If you are very active and interested to take part of all of our presenters, they're wonderful, and I think you're going to have a wonderful Sunday morning tuning in with us. But make sure that you do keep your mute off, and take breaks as you need to, because again, we are recording and we will have full access to it, as we've noted. Now, I'm going to just step in right now and ask Alexandra to read the bio as I stop sharing, but I'll keep this up. And Alexandra, if you want to start the bio of Dan, and we can get started with his presentation, because he is going to be talking about starting seedlings indoors. Okay?
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Amanda. And I would like to welcome Dan. He is a seedsman and a gardener who makes his home on the coast of Newfoundland. He moved here from British Columbia almost 20 years ago after a career in education and publishing. As a founder and manager of Perfectly Perennial Herbs and Seeds, he is focused on seeds for perennials and self-seeding annuals that can help rebuild food security for local families and communities. And if you're interested in any of his seeds, his website is www.perfectlyperennial.ca. All right, Dan, I'll hand it over to you.
So before I get started, I just want to welcome the people who are here. Hi, Ava, Amanda, Alexandra, Ali. Apparently your name has to start with A to attend. It's really neat to be here. I'm really enjoying this. And without further ado, because I do talk a lot, here is the seed starting video.
Hello and welcome to this workshop about seed starting. Before we talk about some of the practical details, I want to give some background for those who may not know some of the story behind what seeds are. and how they work. And the story goes something like this. At some point in the evolution of life on Earth, plants discovered sex. This may sound mysterious and exciting, but simply put, the ability to mix and match genes allowed for better adaptation and evolution as conditions on our planet evolved and changed. Plants did this by creating mechanisms for pollen to be delivered to flowers to pollinate them and combine pollen and the genetic information in the ovaries of the flower. What results is a combination of the genes from the two parent plants. And when that happens, it creates a seed that can be dispersed to a new location to create a new plant. And these seeds are sometimes bare, they're sometimes inside a fruit or a pod, and there's all kinds of wonderful mechanisms to send them out into the world and get them to new places. Some plants, like dandelions, have little umbrellas attached to seeds that float on the breeze and carry the seed to a new place. Some plants have seed pods that burst open and shoot the seeds out. Some have sticky substances or even hooks that will hook onto the fur of a passing animal or onto our pant legs and get carried to another place. Some seeds can be digested and move through the digestive tract and come out in the poop and get fertilized and planted all at the same time. And equally impressive are the conditions needed for seeds to germinate, to sprout. Some pine seeds must be burned in a fire in order to germinate. Some seeds, many seeds, must be conditioned by winter weather or even frozen before they can germinate. And some have to be cracked open or scarred, a process that botanists call scarification. Some seeds are so tightly sealed that they will last hundreds of years and still germinate. And each seed carries within it all the information the plant needs to grow and flourish and reproduce. So, as gardeners, we depend on seeds when we plant our gardens. And over the millennia, wise women, I do believe it was the women, have continued to select which seeds they plant. Corn started out as a shriveled little ear, not bigger than the end of your thumb, called teosinte, a lowland type of grass. But over the centuries, careful selection has created what we now know as maize or corn. And the same process occurred for wheat and citrus and squash, most of the major plants on which we depend for food. And where we are now, and the current threats to biodiversity
Is it working?
come to a large degree because of major
Yeah, because I was
corporations
muted. Okay, bye.
latching on to seeds and trying through them to control our food resources. We'll talk about that possibly later in this workshop or at another time. But the main thing, before we talk about seed starting, is to realize that it is so important that we plant seeds, that we maintain traditional varieties, particularly those that are open pollinated or true breeding, rather than being hybrids. So, whether you're planting a hybrid squash seed from Vessey's or West Coast seeds or Annapolis seeds, you're planting a little bundle of genetic information that will sprout and grow and create another life cycle for the food plant or the beautiful flower that you're planting. Now, if you're interested in accessing a larger list of these wonderful true breeding and heirloom plants, I would suggest that you join Seeds of Diversity and access their list of the 90-something seed houses in Canada, or even better, join them so as a member you have access to the seeds that are being grown by hundreds of other growers and gardeners across Canada. Because as a member of that organization, you will be helping preserve and maintain the diversity of seeds that is now shrunk to a few thousand from the many tens of thousands that were formerly marketed across North America. So to join or to see the list of seed houses at Seeds of Diversity, just go online to www.seeds.ca. So now let's go out to the greenhouse and take a look at the practical details of how you start seeds. In the January greenhouse, it's only about 6 or 7 degrees in here at the moment, even lower than that according to my physical thermometer. But it's not a bad time to be starting plants if you have a place to begin growing them in the winter. And I do. Not here in my unheated greenhouse, but as I will show you, under grow lights in my basement, where I have racks of grow lights capable of starting more than 200 plants in 4-inch pots. So we're going to talk about some of the basics that it's important to know when you're starting seeds. And one of the most important is the soil that you use. You see here, and I'll include a shot of it, I have an entire bale of mycorrhizae Pro Mix, which I will use to start my seeds. Can you use soil from your garden to start seeds? Well, yes, you can, but you run a real danger of getting what is called damping off, a fungal disease that will stunt your plants and kill them. That's because of fungus spores that are in the soil. So I don't want to take that chance. It's too much work to take that chance on the seeds that I plant. So I use a proper sterilized potting soil that I buy by the bale for about $40 or $50. And you can see it's got vermiculite in it. It's very loose. It's made primarily from peat. And that's a suitable starting mix to use because you know you're safe from damping off. It doesn't have much nutrients in it, so you have to be thinking ahead about feeding your plants once they sprout. But for the initial germination, they're fine. You just need the seed to be in the soil, slightly damp, not too wet, and at a temperature that it needs for germination. And there's a chart, which I can share with you, that shows the appropriate necessary minimum temperatures for germinating different types of seeds. Some, like broccoli and other brassicas, germinate at a low temperature, whereas warm weather crops like tomatoes or peppers may need a slightly higher temperature. The process of seed starting is really very simple. It requires a container. Here's a 4-inch plant pot. Here's a little peat pot. Here's a multi-cell seed starting container. And you can also use things like plastic containers that you tend to throw away or recycle. And in this one, I've tried to break a hole in the bottom, and I've managed to fracture the bottom. But as long as it drains, it must drain, I can use this for seed starting. And the process is very simple. You go with your bale of potting soil, you scoop in some soil, some sterilized soil, and you tamp it down, and then you're ready to plant. So I'm going to fill some containers that I can use for seed starting. And as I do that, one of the things that I'm doing as a home gardener who starts his own seeds is I'm creating a kind of a calendar in my mind regarding which seeds I want to start first. The thing is that when you're starting your seeds, you start a wheel turning. You start a calendar, a clock ticking. It will take a certain amount of time, varies from plant species to species, from seed to seed. It will take a certain amount of time for the seed to sprout. But once it does, you have a limited amount of time before it outgrows that pot and then has to be transplanted. You're starting early, in the early spring, to get your plants ready for planting out in late spring and early summer, because you have a window of time, a growing season, when it's warm enough to produce the food that you want your plants to produce. And depending on what type of plant and what type of seed, you might want to start it extremely early or not so early, because you don't want your plants to outgrow the container that they're in before you're ready to plant them out. So as you prepare your pots, fill them with proper sterilized potting soil. You're thinking ahead about which seeds are going to go in which pots at which time. And the more you do this from year to year, and don't be afraid of making mistakes. We all make mistakes. The more you do this from year to year, the more experienced and knowledgeable you'll be, and the better it will go. So now I have my plant pots filled with the soil. Here's a 4-inch pot filled with soil. That's my standard pot size because I find it very easy to work with. I can start more than one seed in a pot. And because they're square and 4 inches, I can crowd them onto a shelf below a grow light to get them started. And I've got a variety of seeds here that I'm going to show you how to plant. I've got some coriander from our garden. I've got some cucumber seeds from Halifax Seed Company. I've got some King of the North sweet peppers from High Mowing in Vermont, one of my favorite non-Canadian seed houses. Some lettuce seeds from Vessey's in Prince Edward Island. Some Feng Ching Choi, which is a wonderful cold-tolerant Chinese green, also from Vessey's. And some yellow tomato seeds from a tomato called Galena that we grew in our garden, which I just love for their flavor and prolific production. And planting the seed is really very simple. So let me start with the coriander and show you how you do that. Simplest thing in the world, in a way. Now, one of the questions that will come up, of course, for people starting seeds is, I have some seeds, and they're from 2017, and now it's 2021, as people say. So these are 4-year-old seeds. Are they any good? Well, that will depend. It will depend on what kind of seeds they are, how you harvested them, and how you stored them. And I'm pretty careful because I run a small seed company, Perfectly Perennial Herbs and Seeds, to store my seeds in a cool, dry place. And if you do that, then seeds can last a long time. Some tomato seeds that I have are already approaching 10 years old. I don't get full germination. Only slightly more than half of them sprout, but those half are still good. So here's some coriander seeds, some cilantro seed from 2017. Am I going to plant these? You bet. And one of the reasons I'm going to do that is because I've planted and replanted coriander here and kale and other plants for years. And I know that as I do that, as I grow the same true breeding variety in the same place year after year, I am slowly but surely adapting to local conditions. Why do I say that? Well, because the ones that don't adapt die and they're gone. And the ones that do survive selectively trim to the local conditions. So what I have here is more than old coriander seed. I have 4 little cilantro seeds from plants that I grew that represent an ongoing process of adaptation to local conditions. And I'm going to take them and I'm going to plant them into this 4-inch pot. And I'm going to plant 4 seeds, 1 in each corner, because that way I can maximize my growth space when I put this downstairs under the lights, which you will see. And then when the plants get bigger, I can tease them out of here and individually transplant them or plant them into the garden, depending on the time of year. Now, there's several different ways to do this, but this is one of the easiest for medium-sized to small seeds. You take a dibbler like this Sharpie, and you make 4 little depressions in the corners of the pot in the soil. Let me show you that. Can you see that? And then you take a seed and you drop it into each one of these little holes and poke it down And now I've got 4 seeds in 4 little holes, and I just go like this. And I'm planted and I'm ready to start growing. Now the final step will be to put this somewhere warm under timed grow lights and give it a bit of water. But I won't do that now. I'll do that when we get downstairs into where the grow lights are. But there is one more thing that I must do, because I'm going to be planting a lot of seeds this year. I have to label these pots so I know what the heck is in them. So I'm going to reach over here to where I have a whole bunch of these little popsicle sticks. And I'm going to take my marker and I'm going to write cilantro, which is the name of the plant. And so I've got my label there. I stick it in the soil, and that pot is ready to go down to the space that I use for starting my seeds, keeping them warm and under lights. Now, when it comes to a larger seed, for example, here's a cucumber seed, and it's not a heck of a lot larger than the cilantro that I just planted, but it is a larger, flatter seed. When you're seed saving in the fall, when you're harvesting these seeds from inside the tomato or the cucumber or the kale pod on the mature kale plant, you have to make sure that they're really, really dry before you store them. And how do you do that? Well, it's called the snap test. A seed like this has to go snap to be dry. Just wasted the cucumber seed, oh my, but I have lots more. So there's a question that I have to decide, depending on how big this plant is going to be when the seed sprouts and how big my pot is. Do I plant 1 seed or 4? In the case of the cilantro, that's easy. Those are feathery plants that will grow up and be easy to separate. So what about this cucumber vine? Even though the seed is small and flat, once it starts growing, it gets to be a honking big thing. So I better start with 1 seed per container. Now, a lot of people plant these days, and I see it online, into peat pods, little round pots held in mesh netting. And I don't do that. And I recommend that you not do that, because those containers are simply too small. Once the seed sprouts and it sets down roots and it begins growing, it will fill that tiny little peat pot in days, and then you have to transplant. So for me, that's a waste of energy. I'm going to instead plant these cucumber seeds into this plastic recycled pot, and I'm going to plant 2 of them, 1 in each corner of this container. I hope you can see them, they're right here. And I'm going to poke them down, poke, poke, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to pat the soil down, and I'm going to go and get my popsicle stick to label the seeds that I planted, and I'm going to go pickle cuke for these Wisconsin pickling things. And I'm going to write Halifax, because I want to know, I've got lots of seeds. I want to know which seeds I planted. So I've got that labeled, ready to go, and I'll stick that in. Now, these containers are really handy because you can start 1 seed per cell, and when it's time to transplant them, the roots will likely have wrapped around and you'll have a nice little easy to squish out ball of soil. And if the soil is slightly damp, it'll hang together, because guaranteed you're going to have to transplant at least once into a larger pot, no matter what you plant in these size of cells. So it makes sense for me to get my seeds, my high mowing seeds for King of the North peppers, and shake out 6 pepper seeds. Hard to count 6 pepper seeds. And I'm going to go down and poke these I'll lay them out first so you can see them on the surface of the soil. And then do exactly the same thing. You can see these seeds hopefully in there. And I'm going to poke them down, poke, 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 give it a shake, and they're covered up. Now, how deep should a seed be planted? 1 to 2 times the diameter of the seed. So one more thing to say is that if you use peat pots for planting, this is a peat pot made out of peat, you need to water more frequently because the water goes right out through the walls of this at a much faster rate. Having explained that, I think we're ready to move downstairs and demonstrate where these plants go while the seeds germinate. The next step in all of this is to explain how to encourage your seeds that you've planted to sprout. And the key to that is consistent moisture, light, and warmth. So what I have here, and I will turn the camera so you can see it, is a setup with grow lights on 2 levels and plastic trays that I purchased very inexpensively from a big box store. These trays are wonderful because they hold the 4-inch pots. They'll hold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 28 4-inch pots, which can start up to 100 or more seeds if you plant 4 to a pot, as I was doing with the cilantro in the greenhouse. And the other thing you can do with these, it's so wonderful, is that you can water from the bottom. What I mean is that using your watering can rather than sprinkling water on the top, you pour it into the bottom and let it soak up through the bottom of the pots. And when you do that, the roots go down to find the water and it encourages stronger root growth. So what I've done here is I've brought in my seeds that I planted, the ones that I showed you, and also a whole bunch of other seeds that I've started. And as I mentioned, when I was out in the greenhouse, it's the end of January. So what the heck am I doing planting seeds in the beginning of January? So the seeds that I've chosen to start now are cold adapted leafy greens that I will be able to plant out into the greenhouse or into covered cloches and cold frames in my garden, because most of my raised beds now have frames over them and some have plastic and glass lids. And when you do that, things that are cold tolerant like lettuce and arugula and corn salad and bok choy and plants like that can do very well outside once they've established and sprouted and developed a strong root ball. So here I have, for example, chard, and I've put 4 seeds. I can see the holes where I put the 4 seeds. And here I have giant red mustard greens, which have such tiny seeds. I didn't try to poke them in. I just sprinkled a few in every one of these pots. And the same thing for the lettuce seed, which is not pelletized and therefore harder to selectively plant. And the same thing is true for rapini, for this form of broccolini that I grow. And then, of course, there's the Galena tomatoes that I planted outside. And the 6 little containers for King of the North peppers, and the pickling cuke in the plastic recycled container, and finally the coriander, cilantro. So what I do next is I set up these grow lights and I place my plants as close to the lights as possible. So how I do that is that these grow lights are hung by chains, and I can lower them down, you see, to get them really close to the plants. I'm going to get this one out of the way while I show and tell. But the idea is that you want your lights to be as close to the plants as they can possibly be, because one of the main mistakes that people make in seed starting is not having enough light. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So these are basically seeded, filled into containers filled with sterilized potting soil. And so this time I'm going to take my watering can, which is really full. I'm going to take one of the containers out of there. And instead of sprinkling water over the top, I'm going to pour water into the bottom of the tray. And because I'm doing that, I'll actually take this off so it goes more quickly. There we go, plugged. By filling it from the bottom, the water that's underneath these plastic pots will soak up into all of them from the bottom. And that wicking up of the water, the wicking of the water up into the soil is really an ideal way to water plants that you're starting, because it helps ensure that you don't have too much water. I can see it's already being sucked up, so I got to water some more. It's surprising how much water you can provide in this way. And the neat thing is that you don't have to water quite as often. If you were to sprinkle a little bit of moisture on top, and these plants are sitting in a warm, dry house, that water that you sprinkle on the top will likely evaporate. And you'll have to come back the very next day and water again. But if you do what I'm doing now, you use a plastic tray and you sit your plants on the bottom and you fill the tray up so that the water in the tray is even an inch deep. Then that water will get sucked up into the bottom of the soil that's in these plant pots, and you don't have to come back the next day and water again. And probably that watering I just did, particularly because the plants are not, the seeds haven't sprouted yet, so they don't need much water. But this will provide enough water for the whole kit and caboodle for days to come. And I'll come back and I'll check by sticking my pinky finger into the soil to make sure that there's some dampness there to support germination. It's a wonderful way to water your plants. Now these lights, these grow lights here, which are LEDs, and these fluorescent tubes, which must be grow lights or full spectrum. The ordinary full spectrum tubes will do just fine, and they're cheaper than the so-called grow light fluorescent tubes. But these lights are on a timer. They're plugged into the wall through a timer, and the timer is set for 16 hours of light during the day and 8 hours off at night. That's an ideal day length because you're trying to maximize the amount of light that you're delivering. And one of the other things that's going on here is that even though this is in a corner of the basement of the house where in the summertime I make my wine, this is a double duty space. It's my wine making space and my seed starting space. So even though it's in a corner of the house, because the heater is right around the corner, there's a steady flow of air through here, and airflow is really important. You can see some other plants here, and you might be curious, like, what's that behind you? Well, this is a lemon plant that I started from seed, from a seed from the Meyer lemon tree in my cousin's backyard in California. You can see some pepper plants here that are overwintering. And this is turmeric root that is growing quite happily here under the lights in a tray, a whole bunch of little threads of turmeric root. So in addition to seed starting, if you set up a very efficient space like this with grow lights on a timer, you can use it to overwinter plants that are perennials. And believe it or not, tomatoes and peppers in the right environment grow as perennials. Pepper plants can go for up to 5-6 years. They have to be fed, they have to be repotted. Okay, so back to the seed starting here. It's very important that you plant the right seeds at the right time. What does that mean? That means that counting back from your first reliable frost-free day, you want to know how long it's going to take after you put the seed in the soil and begin to water it and keep it warm until that plant needs to be planted out into the garden. You work backward in time. And there are plants like the ones that I planted here. Let's mention what they are: rapini and lettuce and giant mustard and chard and radish and this oriental vegetable feng ching choy that are ideal winter crops. So that was the hands-on part of the workshop where I demonstrated how you plant the seeds, select your soil and your containers, and set them up under grow lights and then water them in. And once they're watered in, and I showed you my trick for watering from below, which is more consistent and encourages root growth, then it's a matter of time. It's a matter of waiting. Some seeds can take weeks to sprout, although in most cases, within 5 to 7 days, you'll see evidence of leaves emerging from the seeds into the light. So there's some additional things to go over to make sure that you have a better chance of having success with your seed starting. And these are tips that were published in 2017 by Mark McDonald at West Coast Seeds out in British Columbia. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your knowledge and experience. And I'm going to pass these tips on to you because they are things that I've found to be true and useful in my own gardening. First tip is seeds, when they sprout, don't need fertilizing right away. The seed includes the nutrients that the young plant will need for at least a couple of weeks. When you transplant out of your original pot into a new pot, a larger pot, that's a good time to start dissolving some fish fertilizer, a small amount in the water, or Epsom salts, which really encourages growth. But do that very sparingly. Don't over-fertilize. Second tip that Mark shares, and that I'm going to share as well with you, is the right amount of water. If you see that the top of the soil is a lighter color and is drying out, what you do is you put the tip of your pinky down to see if you can feel dampness. If you can't, put it into the first joint, the first knuckle. If you still can't feel dampness, and particularly if plants start to bend over and wilt from the dryness, then it's time to water. But there is a danger in watering too much. Many people soak their plants down and they do it too often, and the plants get moldy and they die. So you have to maintain a small amount of water until seeds sprout, but even after they poke up and begin growing, only a moderate amount of water. This is something that you learn over time, but mostly it's a matter of paying attention to the plants and to what they're telling you by the way they're growing and getting limp if they need more water. Lesson 3 is plants need lots of light, not a little bit of light, lots, because they need it to grow. They need it for photosynthesis. So grow lights or LED lights or a combination of that and sunlight, placing your plants in a sunny window will likely in the wintertime not provide enough light for growth. They need lots of light. The timer on my lights downstairs is set at 16 hours on and 8 hours off. And that's to ensure that the plants, even under those lights, get enough light. The other thing that I do, you may have noticed this when you were looking at the setup there, is that the lights are hung on chains so I can lower them down and keep them as close to the plants, inverse square rule it's called, as close to the plants to deliver as much light as possible. And as the plants grow using the chains, I raise the lights up. The next factor to talk about is heat. Sprouting happens more quickly. Certain seeds really depend on warmth to sprout. So you want your seeds and the soil that they're sprouting in to be warm. not hot, but warm. If you have a lid or a plastic cover over the pots where you're sprouting your seeds and you put them under lights, take the covers off. They're going to get too hot. You're going to cook them. But on the other hand, if you have a heating mat underneath, which I do for some of my areas, for seeds that really need the warmth, like tomatoes, peppers, and other kinds, and squash, then it really helps to speed up germination. The next key factor is air circulation. If you can buy a fan, invest in a fan, because moving the air prevents buildup of humidity, prevents mold, and the plant stems actually like waving a tiny bit in the breeze. It strengthens them. Air circulation in and around your plants is very important. The next thing to talk about is cats. You may have seen my cat wandering by in an early segment of this video workshop. We have 2 cats. They're sisters. And if we're not careful, for example, when we hung a plastic curtain in front of the setup downstairs that I just showed you, oh, what a nice place for a cat. And they climbed in and they lay down right on top of our seedlings and crushed them. So whether there's the danger of them using your seeding trays as a litter box, or rather just because they like the warmth, you need to think of ways of discouraging them from entering that space. You can figure it out. Another thing is just about timing. Seeds will take a while to germinate and then grow, and you want to time it so that they're ready to transplant at exactly the right time for your outdoor garden if they're going outdoors. And that means calculating back from your last frost day, or even earlier if you have cloches or protection from weather, and planting at exactly the right time. If they get big and they've outgrown the pot they're in, well, you transplant them to a larger pot and keep them going. How do you know when they need to be transplanted? Well, my rule of thumb is that when the plant is as tall as the pot is tall, then the roots have reached the bottom of the pot and they need to be transplanted. And if you don't do that, the roots will reach the bottom and they'll begin wrapping around the outside of the pot and they'll become root bound. And root bound plants won't grow. The expedient thing to do if you discover your plants are root bound when you transplant them is to trim the roots and hope that they'll start growing again. Because otherwise they've received this message that they can't grow, so why bother? The way to ensure that plants don't become root bound is by potting on. That means transferring them to a larger pot. So let's say I planted those 4 little cilantro seeds that I showed you out in the greenhouse, and they've gotten as tall as the plant pot that they're in. What do? You get a larger plant pot, say a 6-inch pot. You make a nice wide hole in the middle of it by packing the soil toward the sides. You take a teaspoon and you carefully extract that plant along with its roots. You don't touch the stem. You don't lift by the stem. You don't even touch it. Stems of germinating plants are very tender. And using the spoon and using your hand, you pick up the root ball, which should be slightly moistened. You transfer that to the larger hole in the larger pot. You gently tamp down the soil on all sides, give it a tiny bit of water, and it's good to go. So that's potting on, and it's an important strategy to know about. The next thing is label the crap out of everything. Label your plants, keep a garden journal, and record everything that you do. And the final thing that I wanted to share with you, it's number 10 on Mark's list, is the process of what we call hardening off. Hardening off is when you take your plants and you get them ready to go outside. And you can't just rush that because the plants have been growing in a perfect, warm, moist, airy space. And if you pop them out on a cold day, they're going to suffer and you're going to see them not do well. So what you do is you bring them out tentatively at first for maybe an hour a day and 2 hours a day on a really nice sunny day. You don't put them in direct sun because the sun as well can fry them. And you gently acclimatize them to the outside environment. If you have cloches or hoop covers or boxes over your raised beds, that can really help protect the plants while they harden off. And if you do all these things that I've been talking about and you've got good seeds, then you're going to have good growth and plants that will do well in your garden. But let's stop and say this one more time. Good seeds is the key. You need to go to the sources where you can find preferably open pollinated, true breeding varieties, good plants for your climate, your location, and learn as you go which varieties do best. And as you do that, you'll acquire knowledge. You'll acquire it as well by talking to your friends, fellow gardeners, neighbors. And the main thing that I have to say to you is this is a learning process. This is a journey. I could tell you stories about the plants that I've killed, but I won't bore you with that. We all have those stories. So gird your loins, plant your seeds, carry on, do it. It's wonderful. And if you ever have questions that you would like answered, I'm always happy to receive emails. Our garden company, Perfectly Perennial Herbs and Seeds in Pushko, Newfoundland, exists to help gardeners. That's our motivation. So if you want to write to me by email, I will, every time you write, I will try and answer your questions or find someone who can. And our email address is info, I-N-F-O, at perfectlyperennial.ca.
Okay.
That was a great presentation, Dan.
Thank you very much.
I think that what we're going to do is we have a couple minutes. If anybody here has any questions at all, they can unmute themselves and ask them live. If not, they can just simply email the email that you had registered for this particular Zoom session, and we can relay them to Dan as well. But I think that was really wonderful, Dan.
Thank you. With this many people, I can certainly have live questions and dialogue. So unmute yourselves if you want to ask anything. And so did Michele Smith show up?
Yes, I think Michele has just come in. We're really happy to see her. I can see her little musician there icon.
That would be her. Hi, Michele.
She's just logging in. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that was wonderful. So anybody who has any questions, you can please ask them now. You can unmute yourself and ask. If not, we'll just go ahead for our bio break and let Michele settle in and learn to share her screen if she doesn't already know. Any questions that anybody has? Well, if not, okay, that's great, Dan. Thank you so much. We will get in touch with you as LEPS very, very soon in terms of some other initiatives that we may be interested in collaborating with.
So that'd be great. Connections are good. Yeah.
No, wonderful. And I can even say, yeah, Ava sent from a note in here for the chat. Thanks for a great presentation. So it was actually very informative. And I know some of the people who had logged in. Sorry?
Whoever that was,
I was just saying, thanks, Dan. I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying, thanks, Dan. I really enjoyed the presentation. It was very informative.
Ava, you're really welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Dan. And I think what we're going to do, if there's no questions, we're going to take a 5-minute bio break and we'll set up for Michele Smith. All right. So Dan will get a hold of you really soon.
Okay. Thank you very much. Great to be part of this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I just want to welcome very warmly Michele Smith. Welcome to the Langley Seedy Saturday event. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but before I do that, I'm going to have Alexander read out your bio that was shared with us from Seeds of Diversity. So thank you for joining us. And like I say, we are a small but mighty crew that's live on our bedroom community in Langley, but we will be sharing all this recording widely with our community partners because we have a lot of requests for the recording. So thank you very much for joining us. And like I say, we'll be going probably about a 45-minute to 47-minute presentation, however you want to, Michele. And then we'll have some questions, hopefully, because they all hear that chirping and I know we're all very fascinated by it. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and Alexandra, I will pass it on to you to start to read out Michele's bio. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. I would like to welcome Michele Smith. She's our second speaker today of our Langley Seedy Saturday webinar event. Michele is an elementary school teacher who helps with gardeners transition from traditional lawn and garden practices to sustainable gardening with food, wildlife, and protection from global warming in mind. In addition to teaching, Michele is an authorized scientific collector of monarch butterflies through the Monarch Teacher Network of Canada and the Toronto and Regional Conservation Authority. She's passionate about teaching and learning with monarch butterflies. So welcome, Michele. I'll hand it over to you.
Hi there. I'm just sharing my screen. I do have two screens on the go, so hopefully that works. I was hoping to be able to see people while I'm sharing, but if it's not, then if you can just let me know, that would be great. And if you're not hearing me clearly, that would be great if you let me know that as well.
We see your presentation and we hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So yes, those are birds in the background at my house. We have come out of -10-degree weather this past week to today. It's about 14 right now. And that's, so I've got my windows open and even with earphones in, the birds are out there. They are calling to us today. So my name is Michele Smith, as was said, and I am an elementary school teacher. I'm very passionate about teaching students about land and connecting them to place, and through an inquiry lens of just having people to really be discovering what a beautiful world we have out there and using that as the base point for our learning. So I have done a lot of learning myself, and I'm happy to share some of the things that have really been on my radar in the past year since COVID has happened. So I work with World Wildlife Federation. I'm doing a pilot project right now on creating a rain garden at my school. So basically the school long ago was it was a swamp, and that was back when everything was clear cutted and filled. And so we have a lot of water. Most of the school year, our students are on the tarmac playing. And so they have to work around this water all the time. And so I'm trying to use that water as a resource. And so I have access to a botanist through World Wildlife Federation that has been really helpful with my learning in this project. And also I'm a butterfly ranger with the David Suzuki Foundation. And I encourage that to anyone. It's a really great group. I am a ranger, but there's always rangers that are looking for recruiters to help them out. And I do focus on butterflies, and specifically on the monarch butterfly, because that is a huge threat in my area, and it is such a vulnerable pollinator. But I do encourage that we are doing a lot of research on all pollinators. We have over 800 species of bees in Canada, and none of those are honeybees. And we are trying to protect our pollinators because it benefits us and the health of our world that we live in as well. So I grew up in a very small town, 5,000 people, called St. Mary's. It's on southwestern Ontario. My property, it was 4.5 acres. It had apple trees in the front yard, and it was up on a hill, and the ravine in the backyard went to a river. So I grew up basically on my own, playing in the mud and exploring outside. Didn't feel lonely ever. I just felt well outside, and I'd be writing and sitting under the trees, and it was really lovely. So I try to bring that experience to my students because they haven't necessarily had that same same connection with the land that I did. As you can imagine, when I went from my small town to York University, which is the third largest university in Canada, 55,000 students, mostly commuters, I call this the concrete jungle. I felt very disconnected from nature. Not that I really realized it at the time. I made jokes about it, but it was definitely a culture shock for me, and took some adjusting to get used to slowly over time. So I did some traveling through Southeast Asia, and I went to teachers college in New York. And then I have settled into, and I love that term, bedroom community. So where I live now is 1,400 people strong, called St. Jacobs. It's predominantly Mennonite, with many old order Mennonite in our community. So if you were to spend some time here, you would see an abundance of horses and buggies, as well as these. So I live in an older subdivision, and there's newer subdivision areas as well, still being built. Some of the buildings were built in the early 1800s, and so there is reclamation of some of the older buildings. Plus, we have the Home Hardware Distribution Center of Canada, which employs a lot of the community. So we have agriculture with industry. And the reason why I live here is there's a beautiful river and lots of nature trails that I can get out of my community setting and feel like I am connected to nature once again. So my school, when we're looking, is pretty lucky. We have a forest that is adjacent to our schoolyards. And when I look at that from a satellite view, I see a lot of grass there for our property, which is unused for most of the year because of the water issues that we have. So what I've been working on is putting pollinator gardens in. We have 2 in, and we're making more of that. As well, I have partnered with an Indigenous community organization, which is helping me to make some Indigenous food gardens that are focused on sustainability. So a little bit of food forestry happening there. And like I said, we are putting in rain gardens so that we can help make that water a resource and channel it into healthy groundwater, as opposed to being redirected into sewers, which is sometimes what happens. So the school and place where I live is part of the Haldeman Tract, which was a treaty, one of the first, number 3, I believe, no, number 4. And that happened when the British purchased land from the Mississauga peoples in recognition of their efforts during the American Revolution. So originally there were 950,000 acres set aside. It's 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from the mouth to its source. And that was established in 1798. So as we can tell, that promise wasn't kept. So then this is the best way that I can help to, with reconciliation, is that I can help to put back into the land some of the things that were taken, and I can help my students to make sure that we are recognizing the enduring presence of the First Nations people, which are the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral people, and their enduring presence and recreating a relationship with the people of this land. And on that same topic, so colonization has meant over time loss of habitat, lack of clean soil and drinking water, pollutants and waste to land and air and water, and many endangered species and species at risk. If we look at a Canadian map, we see that most of our most fertile soil, so our best soil, has been taken up with our housing. So we live on the best soil and we use it for agriculture as well as industry. So I live in southwestern Ontario there where it's the highest industry sector. And there is a lot of agriculture here too, but it is considered one of the most fertile soils for growing food. So I try to do that even at my house now, to make sure that we are using the soil in the areas that it is fertile in the best way that we can. Because so pollinators, if we look at these plates here, are responsible for 3/4 of the world's flowering plants, and 1/3 of the world's food supply is pollinating or is pollinated, which provides us with many essential vitamins and nutrients. Pollinators have seen a steep decline since the 1970s due to habitat fragmentation, degradation, and loss. There has been exposure to agrochemicals such as herbicides and insecticides, which decreases their resistance to pests and other pathogens, and invasive species have been threatening pollinator species over time. So I have chosen to focus on the monarch butterfly, but I encourage, if you don't have monarch butterflies in your area, in Ontario, there is a great resource called Butterflies of Ontario, and it actually ends up being a plant book as well, because the host plant is crucial to the survival of these insects. So the monarch butterfly is threatened across Canada. I have gotten licensing through the Monarch Teacher Network. They work through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. It is important to know that it is illegal to take butterflies out of their natural environment without a license. So I do encourage that it is wonderful learning, and the learning that does happen, especially with children, is unparalleled with any other critters that we can bring in. So it is a wonderful experience, and I do hope that other people can do that as well. So in terms of our pollinators, we need to be making some pollinator-friendly landscapes. And in order to do this, we need to think of our cities as corridors. So even if you live in an apartment and you have a patio, you can put one plant that is a pollinator-friendly plant on your balcony, and you are making a difference. So if you build it, they will come. It is true. I can attest to that. We also want to be leaving our yards a little bit messy, because messy is best for pollinators. If we can leave a few scattered piles of sticks and twigs and leave our grass clippings in areas and some open areas of dry ground, that helps our bees to burrow into the soil, because we do have some nesting bees that way. And it makes mating sites as well for our pollinators. If we can think about growing plants as a source for native pollinators, native plants are best. So finding a supplier who can guarantee that is important to make sure that there are no invasive species, and also considering planting instead of grass. So lawn alternatives require a lot less watering and maintenance, and grass is basically a desert for pollinators. It does not have the nutrients that they require. So I know on my yard, I am slowly creeping in on all of the grass there, just to try to think about that connected corridor where I can make a difference for pollinators by giving them basically a landing strip on their way through to their different areas that they are migrating through. The monarch butterfly depends solely on the milkweed plant. From egg to adult, this is the host plant. So because of habitat loss, this is where we see most of the decrease in monarch butterflies. Monarchs are an insect in the Lepidoptera family. They appeared in the fossil record 400 million years ago. So if we think about the knowledge that this species has come to learn over their existence, they go through complete metamorphosis from a caterpillar or larva to a butterfly. They have scaly forewings, 2 of them, and 2 hind wings. Their proboscis allows them to suck nectar from flowering plants and has led to coevolution between insect and plant. During their 10 to 14 days as a caterpillar, they gain 2,700 times their original weight. If this were a human baby, they would be the size of a school bus by the time they were fully grown. The development from egg to adult takes 24 days to 1 month. There are many factors affecting growth and development. Monarch eggs will not hatch in very dry conditions. Also, drought will kill the milkweed and will affect the growth of the monarch. Hot weather can be lethal, killing all stages of monarchs. Freezing temperatures as well kill butterflies and disable the development of pupae, depending on the length of time that the temperatures are below 0. Herbicides and insecticides sprayed on or near milkweed kills monarchs at all stages of their development. So eggs are very cool to look at. They look like a football shape. You need a magnifying glass in order to actually identify whether it is an actual monarch egg. They're the size of a pinhead. A female lays several hundred eggs, usually on the underside of the leaf. They are ridged with an irregular shape. The eggs hatch about 3 to 5 days after they are laid. In their final day, the egg will turn black at the top. That is actually the caterpillar's head is black colored, and so that's the head showing through. That's when you know it's about ready to emerge. The purpose of the caterpillar is to eat. It stores away energy that the adult butterfly will eat later. It eats the milkweed, absorbing the toxins, making it poisonous, which leads to the color of the adult. So the milkweed toxins are poisonous to the monarch as well, but they have evolved to make adaptations where they will, so the little ones make holes in between the veins and eat around that way, leaving the vein that has the cardiac glycosides or the toxins still intact. The adults will make a notch in the vein and let the toxins spill out, and then they eat the leaf. There are 5 instars of monarch development, each one lasting between 1 to 4 days for the first and second instar. The later ones can be 10 to 15 days. As you see, they get really big by the end with their long antennae. The caterpillars stop eating during the day when they are ready to molt between their instars. They spin a silk mat on the leaf and they use the hooks on their feet to attach to it. Then they puff themselves up with air, which splits the head open of the exoskeleton, and the new monarch caterpillar crawls its way out. The most fascinating stage for most caterpillar aficionados is the hours before the end of the 5th instar. It will go on what is called a walkabout, where it finds a sheltered location. It will spin a silky button on a horizontal surface and hang upside down in a J shape from there. Within a day, it will shed its skin for the last time. It does what is called a pupa dance, where it's wiggling about, and the green pupa emerges. At this point, the caterpillar sticks a black stem called a cremaster onto the surface that it's hanging from. And then it has a silk button in its abdomen that it then attaches like Velcro. The antenna will hang very limply. And after this pupa dance, then that hardening of the shell happens. And it's pretty hard like a fingernail went to touch. And it's very secured with that cremaster there in the silk button. About a day before the caterpillar, before the pupa is finished, this is about 10 to 14 days here in the pupa stage. The green pupa changes and you can see the monarch start to show through from the outside. So it is actually clear and you can see the developing wings there. So to identify butterflies, the males have really large dark spots and females have really large, or they have 2 spots in their hind wings there. And the females have really dark veins throughout. So you can see that in the picture there. When butterflies emerge, they are very fragile. Their wings are crumpled and moist for about 15 minutes. They have 7 air holes connected to a maze of tubes throughout their wings. They pump their swollen abdomen, which is full of fluid, and this causes the fluid to go to the end of their wings through those tubes. The wings are dry after a few hours, but a monarch should not be handled for the first day. Their proboscis is actually in 2 pieces when they come out, so they roll it in and out until it zips together, making like a straw. The primary job of the adult monarchs is to reproduce. They reproduce at 3 days old. They remain together from afternoon until early morning, and then the female lays her eggs after the first mating. Both sexes will mate multiple times and live about 2 to 5 weeks. The final generation of late summer butterflies lives up to 9 months. Their job is to migrate to Mexico or coastal California west of the Rocky Mountains, where cool conditions allow them to slow their metabolism until springtime, when they will have their return flight. The adults don't grow in size, but they do need a large amount of fuel to get ready for their flight. They visit a variety of flowers and other nectar sources, such as mud puddles and even feces. They do need stones and wet areas then so that they can do their puddling, and the stones help them to be able to dry out in the sun. Late summer monarchs are actually in reproductive diapause. They will not mate until the following spring. They migrate only by day when the sun drops to 57 degrees above the southern horizon. They travel up to 128 kilometers a day at 15 to 50 kilometers an hour, taking advantage of south-moving masses of cold air. They start arriving in Mexico around November 1st, which is long celebrated there as the Day of the Dead. They cluster together in large numbers on roosting trees that are used year after year. Scientists believe that pheromones left on the tree might help them to locate the same trees the next year. They stop to refuel on nectar, and they actually gain up to 35% of their original weight during their journey south. They're excellent gliders and they have been seen at elevations of 300 to 2,100 meters above the earth. They make this journey using a sun navigation system. So it is time compensated so that they know exactly where the sun is and where they need to be. West of the Rockies, the monarchs overwinter along the California coast, roosting in eucalyptus trees, Monterey pines, and Monterey cypresses. This may represent 5% of the worldwide population. Last year, only 2,000 were recorded. East of the Rockies, monarchs migrate through a geographical needle in Texas. They cluster in dense colonies covering tree trunks and branches of pine and fir needles, which are predominantly oyamel fir in that area. Dehydration is a serious threat to survival of monarchs, so they fly to nearby water and drink during warmer, sunny days of winter and early spring in Mexico. The forest acts as an umbrella and blanket. They nest on sites that are generally steep and southwest facing slopes. They form about 9 dense colonies. So an area of a football field can host millions of butterflies. Scientists are not certain how these same sites are located, as I had mentioned before, but it is quite a magnificent phenomenon that has developed over millions of years. By mid-February, increasing temperatures and day length cause reproductive diapause to cease. Monarchs then begin to mate in large numbers in preparation for the return migration in the middle of March. They can be tracked through an organization called Journey North, where you can see on the map where they are making their journey. They fly north in search of milkweed to lay their eggs. It is their children, their grandchildren, and their great-great-grandchildren that will recolonize the northern states and provinces later that spring. So it's like a relay race of generations. Depending on the length of the growing season, there can be 3 or 4 generations of summer monarchs before the cycle begins again. There are many threats to the overwintering monarch, such as extreme weather, ongoing logging of the old growth forest, which is both legal and illegally happening. There are 2 species of birds, the black-backed oriole and the black-headed grosbeaks, and a species of mouse in Mexico that can actually feed on the monarchs without suffering the effects of the milkweed toxins. Around here, if you see a bird that has nipped a wing of a monarch, you'll see them throwing up shortly after. So, as I've said before, the monarchs suffer from dehydration, and climate change is the biggest factor for them. So because they have such a fragile temperature range, global warming is definitely a threat to them, and there is no other place on Earth where they will be able to do their overwintering. In Mexico, ecotourism allows for a lot of income for people there. The land used by monarch colonies in Mexico is not owned by the federal government. Much of the land is owned by the ejidos, which is an indigenous community. The tags, Monarch Watch pays $5 for each tag or a tagged butterfly that is reclaimed. So this is a really good source of income for the people there. It encourages hours of sifting through dead monarchs on the forest floor, as $5 is half a day's pay in Mexico. Most monarch eggs and caterpillars do not actually survive in the wild. Less than 1% survive. They become food for other things. Pupal emergence problems can result from a parasite called OE, which has likely co-evolved with the monarchs. Human rearing practices can also cause decline in the monarch's ability to migrate. So when monarchs are reared inside, they are not exposed to direct sunlight, which they need in order to develop that internal compass that they use for navigation. Also, when monarchs are reared inside, their wings are much smaller, and so they would not be able to make the flight. Since the survival rate is so low already, it is important that we do have proper licensing in order to know that we are causing no harm and using the monarchs for reclaiming their species, regenerating their species. There are 100 species of milkweed that grow in North America. 14 of these grow in Canada. It is one of the first plants to move into an open area that has been disturbed by people or nature, usually by fire. Indigenous North Americans have used milkweed as medicines. They use the stems, or they did in the past, to make bowstrings and ropes. The buds and pods can be eaten. The sap has been used as a natural adhesive and has been used to relieve poison ivy and to get rid of warts and age spots. The silk, which is attached to the seeds for their dispersal, is very buoyant. And so it's more so than cork, 6 times more buoyant than cork. And so it has been used to absorb oil after oil spills. And it has also been used for stuffing for life jackets. Milkweed appears in the spring, reproducing from the seeds of last year's milkweed or sprouting from creeping underground rhizomes. It is very aggressive that way. Roots can grow 4 meters deep, and the length of the horizontal roots can increase up to 3 meters in a single season. A piece of root, about 2.5 centimeters, can produce a new plant. The plants do not flower until the second year. Cross-pollination is essential. Only 2 flowers of several hundred become fertilized and produce seeds. The flowers grow in clusters with 5 cups, which has 50 flowers in each cup, each of which contains nectar. Each flower has a dumbbell shape with 5 up and 5 down. Bees are attracted to milkweed flowers. They put their feet to rest and discover that it is smooth and slippery and leads to pollen in the cup. As the bee bends to sip on the nectar, it pumps its feet in order to keep its balance, which then gets stuck in a slit in the cup, and the cup then clamps down and also opens a slit with, it's called a black dot, which is holding the pollen. When the bee is finished eating, it dislodges its foot, opening the clamp, and then the attached pollen bag comes out unless the bee is not strong enough, and it dies on the flower. So the pollen bags that are left behind start to grow tubes down the flower to the bottom where it's fertilized. And it fertilizes a tiny ovule, and then that becomes where a seed, and the part of the flower that holds the seed begins to turn into a pod. The meadow is an ecological community of living things where individuals compete and cooperate and interact with each other. Milkweed is the foundation of a mini ecosystem or food pyramid, providing food for a diversity of insects that are herbivores or grazers like the monarch. Fly and wasp parasitoids search out insect grazers, laying their eggs on young caterpillars or on the leaves they eat. The parasitoid larvae that emerges from these eggs eat the caterpillar. Some insects feed on the nectar of milkweed flowers. Other insects may be found resting on milkweed plants. Aphids feast on the milkweed sap and leave a sticky poop, which is called honeydew, on the leaves, which evaporates into sugar, attracting bees, wasps, flies, ants, butterflies, moths, and other microorganisms. Aphids can be very damaging to the plant. To get rid of them, you can spray with water, causing them to drop off, or you can dip the milkweed stalk in a bucket of soapy water and just make sure that you use fresh water afterwards in order to clean off the soap. These are some other grazers of our ecosystem. You can notice that they have eaten milkweed by their same coloring that the monarch butterfly has. So predators to the monarchs, some other organisms. So to get milkweed started, you have two options. You can germinate the seeds yourself, or you can transplant roots of an existing plant. In order to germinate, you're going to gather seed pods in late summer when pods are brown and splitting open. You separate the fluff from the seeds and then dry the seeds out. I use a paper towel to do that. Then you can keep the seeds in a paper envelope or in a glass jar. You can place them in the freezer for 2 to 3 months, which then will act like it's wintertime. When you're planting seeds in the springtime, plant them shallow, about 1/4 inch, in sunny, warm locations that are going to get watered well. Germination takes about 8 to 14 days. You can induce germination by scarifying, repeatedly water soaking and drying the seeds between damp paper towels to break their dormancy ahead of time. When you're transplanting the roots, you are going to be taking as much as you can of the rhizome. Each rhizome is a clone of an original plant, and so they connect by their underground roots. If you are using common milkweed, you want to put a barrier in the ground where you want them to stop, or they can take over as they are very aggressive. Transplants can be successful at any time of year, but spring is best. The stalks will wilt up first, but if they're watered every day, they do generally survive. When they're first transplanted, it may not compete well with the other weeds, but once it's established, it will likely take over. I use a swamp milkweed, which is less aggressive, and it is really quite pretty, and it's not quite as aggressive. So I would recommend using one of those in a home garden. Cutting back the milkweed shoots in the early summer, it will stimulate its growth. So as well, if you do have a lot of monarch activity and you do want to cut it down, it will regrow. You just want to make sure that there are no eggs or caterpillars or anything on there that you are then endangering. So a native plant is something that grows naturally in its particular location. Species that are native to an area have been developed there. They have evolved over millions of years. And so they don't require as much water, and they don't require as much as work, really, because they are adapted to the sunlight and other factors. So exotic species can become invasive even from home gardens. Dandelion is a major one that we all know about, I'm sure, and deal with, which is not harming our ecosystem, as we can use it for many things, but it is something that wasn't originally here. So milkweed has in the past been considered a weed and an invasive weed because of the milkweed toxin. So in farmers' fields, originally for the settlers, the cows would be eating them and they'd start to throw up. And it was coming up in the crops. So it's only now that we're realizing the importance of this plant and the sustainability of our biodiversity and the importance of it. I do have 10 steps for creating a butterfly garden. This is our pollinators as we had just planted them, our pollinating gardens at the school in the fall, and they got snowed on almost right after. So you want to start small. You can always enlarge the garden later on as you have more people to help you and join in. These are some of my monarchs in my rearing cage last year as they were just about to go into they're in their J shape and almost doing their pupa dance. Number 2 of my butterfly garden creating tips is to enlist support and help of other people. You want to be educating as many people as you can about the importance of these gardens. And so doing this in phases will help you get more people involved, and you can make a bigger difference this way and get some more help. Number 3 is to locate the garden in a sunny area. So you're thinking about a meadow. You need to be thinking about the kinds of plants that you're putting in. You need host plants as well as your nectar sources. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead there. Thinking about water sources. So especially when they're getting established, you need to be using a lot of water. After that, they maintain themselves much better, but you can mulch the garden and that will help to keep the water in, and it suppresses your weeds, so it makes less work. Including both annual and perennial plants can be helpful. Native plants are the most important thing. So you want to be making sure that you've gone to a creditable plant source and checking to see what host plants you maybe are lacking in your area, and thinking again about that corridor of migrating insects. Consider having a damp or shallow area or puddle in your garden so that the butterflies can drink and extract minerals from the soil. Flat stones and bare soil or vegetation in the garden for butterflies can help them to perch on. Then they can bask their wings in warmer temperature. You want to be planning so that your plants will bloom throughout the growing season. So from early spring to late fall, you want to be providing nectar sources. Also, if we can avoid raking our yards until the end of really into summer, it helps with some of our nesting insects that are in the grass and in our clippings on the ground. And absolutely do not use pesticides in or near the garden. Most traditional garden pesticides are actually toxic to butterflies. And if we need to, we can use predatory insects or we can hand remove pests ourselves. So some of the sources that I have worked with and connected with have been the David Suzuki Foundation, using Journey North, Mission Monarch. There is a really good learning course through Landscape for Life, which I plan to take in the future, but I've been extracting some information from for now. If you go to Xerces, you will find the butterflies of your area. And then there are many other wildlife and community resources, I'm sure, that people in your area are hoping to teach you about. And that's all that I have for now.
Wow, Michelle, that was a fantastic presentation. The one thing about the Fraser Valley that we're in within Langley and surrounding areas is we really appreciate pollinators, and you just gave us just a ton of extra resources and information. It was amazing. I will open it up if you would like to unmute yourself. If you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. If not, Michelle, do you mind LEPS, the Langley Environmental Partner Society, to contact you for additional information? I know you're a school teacher and we work with schools, but we would love to connect with you with what you're doing. Yeah, because we would love to bring whatever you're doing and in any information context to all our school gardens as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great.
So you can type it in the chat if anybody has any questions, but yeah, I personally, what does Dan have?
A milkweed pod.
talking that I went upstairs to my seed stash, my garden stash, and found these. And I've had a bunch of seeds for some years. My understanding is that monarchs are only accidental here in Newfoundland, whereas they regularly come to the rest of Eastern Canada and Ontario. So I'm definitely going to plant some because I maintain a garden for some neighbors who migrate from Ontario, and they had me plant a butterfly garden. So I'm going to plant the milkweed there in the hopes that we might capture some stray monarchs when they get blown off course by storms. Michele, you must know about the video called Metamorphosis. You know of that one?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, isn't it beautiful? And that's
Yeah.
that's available right now on CBC Gem, and it's an hour-long documentary that uses the story of the monarchs as a metaphor for the transformation that we're undergoing as humans as climate changes.
I was also, there's a conservation area close to me that did a presentation the other day, and they talked about, like you said, that we need to be moving some of our native plants further out so that we can be making sure, because with the climate changing and warmer weather in different places, that we can be taking care of wildlife where it ends up. So thank you for planting those.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's just wonderful. I thank both of you so much. We are again a small and mighty crew, but we're going to be sharing this recording very widely. We have a lot of community partners within our township and surrounding areas, and this is probably the best presentation that we could ever have dreamt of. And I thank both of you, Dan and Michele. They're both very inspiring. And no one does have any questions, but you know what's funny about bedroom communities? Questions come in after. So that's the one thing, is that I'll probably be emailing you or Alexandra some questions that people have, because Zoom is very new to many people, and we don't really want to intimidate them, and sometimes people don't know how to manage the chat feature. So both of you, thank you so much. Feel free to leave at any time. We're going to be taking another 5-minute bio break, and to which we'll get set up. And I see Seeds of Diversity is here. I'm hoping that is Bob, and he will get us up and on our way for Heritage Flower Gardens, because that's also very important, and it kind of is in line with both of your presentations. And I will round us out with the whole climate change. And I'm adapting my presentation to the area that we're in within the Fraser Valley. And we also do see some, actually, Michele, we do see some monarchs here. This is one thing that we need to probably go to that map and document that, because we do see them, and we just don't.
I wanted to comment that, Michele, you're a teacher, I'm a retired teacher, and getting kids directly exposed to natural phenomena is really critical, especially at a young age. And the school that I was principal of in the Gulf Islands, we had a raised bed garden where we raised half the food for the lunch program in the school, which the kids cooked and served. But it doesn't have to necessarily take that form. And you bet that if a student in grade 4 has an encounter with a monarch butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, they will never forget that, ever. And it will become a touchstone in their life. So if there's other teachers out there, I want to encourage you to think about ways you can engage your students, because those are the people who we need to connect with, is the young
Absolutely.
folk. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, welcome to our third session here on our Langley Seedy Saturday. We're really excited to have Bob with us. He's going to talk to us about Heritage Flower Gardens. And I'm just going to give a little quick intro for him here. So Bob has been saving seeds and teaching about food diversity for over 20 years. As a horticultural specialist at the Waterloo Region Museum, he cares for the gardens in the Dune Heritage Village that feature over 200 species of heritage plants. Bob is also the executive director of Seeds of Diversity, an organization that conserves Canadian heritage seeds and plants from coast to coast. Let's join Bob for a trip back in time to flower gardens of the early 1900s. All right, hand it over to you, Bob. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So yeah, so two places where I work. One is Seeds of Diversity, and it is a seed-saving organization. We're really just so pleased that we can be part of a lot of Seedy Saturdays across the country this year in this unusual format. Because Seeds of Diversity is a seed-saving organization. We're a membership group of people who grow rare and unusual heritage plants in our gardens at home, fruits, vegetables, herbs, grains, flowers. And the purpose of the organization is to save seeds so that the varieties that we are in danger of losing will be perpetuated, that we can save seeds, offer them to other people, circulate them around, and the more people who grow those rare heritage varieties, the more likely they will be to survive into the future, so we can keep on growing them. And that feeds into my my other part-time job, which is at a museum in Ontario. It's called the Dune Heritage Village. In Kitchener, Ontario, it's a living history museum that has a historic village that's recreated to the year 1914. My job there is to recreate and interpret the gardens which go along with that village, and to demonstrate the landscaping and the food customs that go along with a village of the year 1914. And I think it's worth saying because I have made this presentation most of the time for people in Ontario, but across the country we can see by this period of time, by the early 20th century, we all had the same kinds of things. We all had the same plants and garden and nursery catalogs all across Canada and throughout North America all show the same flowers, the same vegetables, all of the same tools. We had really become a much more consolidated country by 1900 than you might suspect. Of course, back in the 1800s, different parts of Canada were very different from one another, but by the time the coast-to-coast rail system had been established, we were transporting all kinds of stuff back and forth. And so in coastal BC, you could order anything from anywhere in North America and have it come in on the train, and people in Halifax could do the very same thing. So what I'm going to show you applies just as well to people in BC as it does to people in Ontario, or in fact anywhere in North America for this particular period of time. We have in this historic village of ours a number of houses which represent different cultures. This one happens to be an Old Order Mennonite house, which is a really interesting thing for the Kitchener-Waterloo area. If you've ever traveled in rural Pennsylvania or my part of Ontario, you will have seen Old Order Mennonites and Amish who still live the very same way that they did 100 years ago. And that's a really interesting resource for us to have the history and also the plants and the traditions of a people who have changed over 100 years, but still live very much the same way. Now, this is an Old Order Mennonite kitchen garden. It's very similar in lots of ways to kitchen gardens of the time that other people had, and by kitchen garden, I mean that it's a garden that was literally grown right outside the kitchen. So I'm standing in the upstairs bedroom right now, taking a picture out the window, but below me on the main level is the kitchen, where we think probably 17 people had lunch and dinner at the same time. And right outside is a garden, which has carrots and lettuce and peas and herbs, all things that you would pick fresh and use right away. So they're right outside where they can be got right away, because we don't have a fridge in 1900, and we would prefer our food to be freshly picked for every meal. Whereas in a garden like this, I don't see any potatoes here. I don't see any corn growing. We don't have squash. Those are all plants that would be grown in a field someplace further away. So this is a kitchen garden. And we might see lots of evidence of kitchen gardens through this next hour. All the work that we do at our museum is done by hand. in the appropriate way. So we have either old tools or replicas of old tools. They don't always let us use the actual originals because they're a bit precious and we don't want to break them. Would I get in trouble for breaking a museum antique? Yes, I would. So they don't let me use them every day. But we have some talented blacksmiths and handy people who can make replicas of those tools. So you'll see this at many living history museums. The right clothing, the right materials, the right tools, and in fact, the right seeds. And that's kind of where my experience in seed saving comes in, because many of the plants that we grow are heritage varieties. We have heritage cucumbers, heritage tomatoes, heritage beans. The orange tomato that you see at the top and the pole bean that you see at the top right, those are local heirloom varieties that in those cases they're old order Mennonites who have grown these particular varieties of tomatoes and beans for over 3 generations, saving the seeds every year. And I have not been able to find any other varieties of tomatoes or beans that are quite the same. So they're actual local heirlooms. And the only way that we can get the seeds to plant these are to grow our own seeds. So in fact, seed saving is something that we do. I'll talk in this presentation mainly about flowers. I wish that I could talk about vegetables and grains and all sorts of other things, but we only have a little bit of time here. So I'm going to focus on the flower gardens of 100 years ago. And like I said, you'd find the same flowers in every seed catalog from every seed catalog across the country by 1900. And it was a wider assortment of seeds than you would see today. I will start off by talking a little bit about the way people lived, because I think that gives some idea of how valuable gardening was for people and how popular gardening was, even more than today. We could find more diversity of flowers, a greater assortment of different species and different varieties than we can today in the seed catalogs that we can find from that period. And that's really intriguing. I'm going to talk about annuals and annuals and perennials. Perennials are the plants that you plant once and hopefully you don't have to plant them again. They just keep on coming back year after year. Annuals are the plants that you grow from seed every year. And since they grow differently, that actually influences the kind of garden where you grow them, annuals versus perennials. And so I'll get into that. It makes a big impact on how gardens were designed and how people lived in their gardens too. But first of all, this is a typical farmstead, and I think you would find this pretty typical layout of a farmstead just anywhere you looked. A house and a barn. There are some long row gardens on one side, other row gardens on the other side of the house, a small orchard. People mostly lived in the country at this time. If we look at the census and find out where people lived, we find that more than half of Canadians lived in the country, and most of them worked on farms. Today, it's the opposite. Today, by far, most people live in cities, and only a fraction of people live in the country anymore. It meant that there were many more people then who really knew their plants. Lots of people know plants, and probably all of you on a talk like this, you're probably all gardeners and you all know your plants. But I mean all the people who are not on this talk who don't think of themselves as gardeners. Well, 100 years ago, they would have, because if more than half of the people lived in the country and worked on farms, and the other half of the people had probably only recently moved to a city, they had probably grown up on a farm. Think of that. Everybody knew how to grow stuff. Everybody knew their plants. And that made a whole population of gardeners. And not to make it all look too pastoral, because this was 1900, and what does that mean? It means that there were cities, and the cities were built up, and there was transportation infrastructure, there was hydroelectric power. We didn't quite have radio yet, but we had telegraph. So you could send messages to people anywhere in the world, not quite as easily as we can today, but you could communicate anywhere in the world. And so people had news that was right up to date. It was more modern than I think we probably think of what 100 years ago was like. There was a somewhat diversity of wealth. There were very, very wealthy people, and those people were very interested in plants. And so there was a market for expensive tropical plants to be brought in from other parts of the world. There was a market for all the horticultural innovation that you can imagine. And that drove horticultural innovation. We had vast gardens. We had enormous seed companies and nurseries, and they were dealing in every kind of horticultural species that you can imagine. We also had people who lived in a more modern kind of economic scale. There were rich people, and there were poor people, and there weren't so many middle-class people. But I think overall, it seems to me that people were not unhappy. There were, of course, people who were unhappy, but we shouldn't think that people who didn't have the means to buy a lot of things were unhappy. They just didn't have a lot of things. And this is something that I think is really important when we think about old-fashioned gardens. And then this will come up, and I'll try to make it more clear as we go along. But if people didn't have as many things in their lives, and people didn't have as much cash to buy lots of things that we own today, it means that they would turn to the abundance of the garden. And it would matter to them a lot that they could grow lots of flowers and that they could grow lots of vegetables. And they gave their flowers a kind of a personal and even sentimental value, because those were the things that they had in their lives. We see these people in these black and white pictures were writing poetry about their flowers. And it's very touching to think that their gardening was maybe the most wonderful thing that they did in their lives. And my own grandfather used to say that after work, and he worked 12-hour days back then, gardening was the thing he loved to do. And I think, well, good thing that I'm descended from that man. People worked really hard. There was lots of work to do, and without the conveniences of rototillers and machines to help us, we had to do this work by hand. It involved lots of people. That's why so many people lived in the country. But it's also a time in history when people were finding more leisure. And this is a transformative period of time, about 100 years ago, when people were moving from the farm to the city and finding jobs in the city and factories that were making things that allowed the country people to have less work to do. So people moved to the city and built, say, agricultural equipment that allowed more people to move to the city. People didn't have to travel by horse around to get around because there were trains and trolleys. People didn't have to do the same kinds of menial labor that they had once had to do, because there were more and more machines. Some of them were electrical powered, some were gas powered, but those machines were the first to catch on, because if you innovate and you have a little bit of money to spend and you're doing manual labor, that all equates to the machines that take over your manual labor become the first to be adopted. And that's what we see in early technology in farming. So people had some time off. What would they do with their time off? They would garden, because they knew their plants. If they didn't grow their own flowers on a farm, they had grown up growing their own flowers on a farm. And so they grew their flowers in a city instead. Here's a garden, which is just a flower garden. It doesn't have row gardens of vegetables on either side of the house, and there's no apple orchard, because this family doesn't have to grow their own food. They have a job. This might be a teacher. This might be a postmaster. It might be someone who works in a factory. But they're growing a flower garden for their own enjoyment. And that's a new thing around 1900, when we had time to do that. And this is the sort of thing that we see all across the country around this period of time, people who had some time, they were starting to get, say, Sundays off of work. My grandfather that I mentioned, he had to work 7 days a week, and it was 12-hour days, 7 days a week. And it was quite something when they got Sundays off. That was starting to happen around this time. And when you had some time off, where would you go? How would you spend that time? People saw in larger cities and municipalities public parks, and everybody wanted them. Everybody wanted public parks, all about the same time. So what's interesting to see is that the cities in Canada mostly copied their public park designs from bigger cities like New York City, Boston. So if you look at Central Park in New York City, look at Boston Common in Boston, those kinds of examples, the elements of those parks seem to be copied into the larger parks in Canada. And then the elements in those parks seem to be copied into the parks of the smaller municipalities. So every public park kind of has this open layout. There's a row of trees, but leaving a nice open space for people. And then within that space, there are meandering paths that allow people to wander. The paths don't go anywhere. They don't get you someplace. They allow you to wander instead. And then there are these island flower beds. You see these 3 or 4 what are called island flower beds. They're round. Usually you put a tall plant in the middle and a medium-sized plant around that, and small plants around the outside. And they're called island beds because they're just sort of islands out in the middle of the grass. And one of their purposes is to prevent people from trying to play sports here, because they don't want that here. They want that, maybe there's a sports field someplace else, but they want to leave this space accessible for our friends having a picnic or some sort of family photo here. There's a gentleman with a watering can. I don't know why he's posing with a watering can, but people didn't take pictures very often. So you often see these sort of artificial poses in photographs. So it was very special for these people to be in front of a camera. So they've decided to pose in various ways. But this is copied also from the great parks of Europe. That's really where this design originally came from. You think of Versailles, okay? That's what they copied for the big city parks, and the municipal parks are copied from the city parks. People in their homes copied this look in their homes. So in a way, with their new leisure time, people were trying to replicate this look of a park in their home garden too. And this is probably the reason why they were doing that. Cities didn't, or towns like this one, didn't have paved roads usually. Property standards were not the sort of thing that we associate today. People had maybe come from a farm setting where the idea of making a property look nice to your neighbors is not something that comes into your mind. Once people are living next to each other and they have neighbors, it took a little while for them to learn that they should make their place look nice for the neighbors, you see. And so this idea of raising property standards was an important concept all across the country in all of our new villages and towns. And so that's why horticultural societies were invented. All those garden clubs, all those horticulture societies, and just about every municipality has one. They started out as committees that were dedicated to beautifying their town because they didn't want it to look like this. Horticulture societies looked at those parks and they said, well, this is the kind of look that we should encourage. And so they encouraged people to make their gardens in these sort of nice layouts. Here's a girl named Dorothy Newton who won a prize for her garden. And it's a beautiful garden. It looks like she tends that and sweeps the paths with a broom to keep it so tidy. Well, these prizes, and our horticulture societies and garden clubs still have prizes for the nicest tulips and the nicest dahlias and the nicest collection of peas. Those prizes were there from the beginning in order to incentivize gardening and making your property look nice, creating a more beautiful look in the community. Here's an example of a school. Schools were encouraged to promote learning how to grow flowers, learning how to make an attractive garden. The idea of hard work was considered to be a virtue for children to learn. I don't disagree with that completely. The virtue of cleanliness and tidiness and making something look the right way, that was a virtue that should be taught to children. I don't completely disagree with that either. But look at the size of this school garden. The bottom picture, you can see the schoolhouse with the bell tower. They would ring the bell to call the kids in. All that space out in front, that's the school garden, where they're teaching horticulture, agriculture, botany, the value of hard work, the value of perseverance, and probably the value of handling disappointment. Because as gardeners, we have all learned how to handle disappointment, and that's character building. So this was more than merely educational about facts and biology. It was a whole character development exercise, and they used gardens extensively for kids, all part of the Horticulture Society movement, and all part of the combination of wanting to beautify the place where they lived, but also to make people care about beauty. It even extended to train stations. Here are 2 train stations, and there are examples of this all across the country. And you won't see, I think, gardens at train stations very much anymore. There are a few that still maintain them. But at one point, the Canadian Pacific Railway had gardens at 1,500 different stops. And they managed these gardens. It was part of the corporation to have something beautiful at the train station. Part of it was to show off how strong the CPR was, because the CNR was doing some of this, the Grand Trunk Railway was doing some of this in the East, and they wanted to show off that they were a bigger, stronger company than the others. Part of it, though, was motivated by going back to those sort of rough villages that had non-paved roads and sort of had ditches beside the road, and people weren't really keeping up the property standards the way that people thought they should. The train station was the very first place that most people would see. Remember, you wouldn't come into a town by the highway, you would come in through the train. So if the local horticulture society wanted to beautify the town, the first place to start is by beautifying the train station. It would create a really nice first impression, and it would give people a sense that this was a good community, a virtuous community even, and one where it might be good to stop and settle and live. And that meant that the industrialists of the town, the people who owned the businesses, the mayor of the town, would be members of the Horticulture Society, promoting that kind of look, because this was seen as the way to get people to invest in the town, to invest, put a business here, settle, make a farm. If the town had that look, then it would be more attractive for settlement, and that's why you see these train stations and 1,500 different train stops with gardens at them. Now we have a lot of different perennials that people grew. This one is called valerian. It's a herb, but it's also a really nice tall plant that it blooms in June and has a beautiful vanilla fragrance. This is the kind of plant that people probably would have had available. Early on, many of our garden plants were perennials. They were brought from Europe, they were imported from Asia, but the effort required to grow annuals was a little much for people. So they tended to plant perennials and tended to have perennial gardens like this one. This is a sort of a typical perennial garden. It's a combination of lots of different kinds of plants that bloom at different times. The challenge with perennials is that they often bloom for only a short time. So you have to mix together lots of different kinds to get bloom in a consistent fashion throughout the season. It's also a little bit difficult to move the parts around. If you have phlox in one section, you're probably going to have phlox there next year too. And if you have this row of coral bells is what's along the path, you're probably going to still have that edging of coral bells next year, because it's a lot of work to move stuff around when they're perennial. We don't have that much difficulty moving annuals around though. You replant them every year. And so here's a totally different kind of garden. This is a garden made of annuals. There's salpoglossus down on the floor in the middle and stalks going around in a circle. And in the very middle is a castor bean plant, a tropical plant from Africa. But all these grow from a seed in 1 year. That means you could do it completely differently next year. Choose a different pattern of color, choose a different design. You could, instead of a circle, you could make it a square or fill it in the middle instead of having a path going around. Another thing about this is the tropical look of it. 100 years ago, we could get any kind of plant from anywhere in the world because we had good train service and because most of the jungles and remote parts of the world had been explored and plants had been collected and been domesticated. But these tropical plants were still quite new. So this was a look that felt really exotic. It felt really different. It felt really modern, having this tropical kind of look. And so it would be a focal point. It would be something that you would have on purpose, even just a home garden, this kind of look. Today, we might see this kind of look in a park. And remember, people were trying to copy that public park look because that's what they saw as the sort of modern aesthetic, along with the tropical look and along with the diversity of annuals and being able to change what you grew every year. So that was the kind of exciting look compared to the grouping of perennials. Here we have an oval of marigolds. There's some ageratum and looks like maybe a little cosmos in the middle. Cleome at the back with some red salvia and alyssum around that. All of this could be a completely different design next year, and that was fantastic. That was so exciting to be able to change your garden absolutely top to bottom, color, shape, design from year to year. It allowed people to do fun things. Here's a heart made out of portulaca. Red portulaca in the middle and white around the border. You can separate portulaca today if you say go to the nursery and buy some mixed portulaca, because that's the only way you'll get it. You won't get it by color. You'll get a mixture of colors, but you can recognize the red flowers will grow from the plants that have red stems. They have a sort of a red color on the stem, and the white flowers will grow from plants that have a very light colored green stem. So you can actually separate these today, and that's how I did it to make this picture. But back then, you could buy portulaca by color. You could buy red seed, or seed of red portulaca, seed of white portulaca, and yellow and salmon and purple and pink and half a dozen other colors too, because people were doing that sort of thing. This is to kind of illustrate what we mean by Victorian gardens and Edwardian gardens. Many people associate Queen Victoria with a sort of a rigid time in history when people had very specific personal values and there were very strict hierarchy in life. And many people sort of think of the later Edwardian period as being a relaxing time when people could be a little bit more free and have a little bit more upward mobility in society and so on. Well, that's why the names appear for these kinds of gardens. A Victorian garden is usually a very strict geometrical kind of design, whereas an Edwardian garden is a more free form, more natural kind of a look. What's sort of interesting about this to me is that formal garden look was very popular during Queen Victoria's reign in England. And that Edwardian look was popular in England during King Edward's time. That's her son. But it took about 30 to 50 years for those different garden styles to catch on in Canada. So we were still planting Victorian gardens and valuing that Victorian look during Edward's time. And it took us until quite a bit later until we softened things up and got to the more natural Edwardian look. We were simply that much behind the times in Canada. We had annuals. This is a powder puff aster. And asters were by far the most popular annual flower. There are many different kinds of asters. This is a powder puff aster. This is a Krigo aster, sometimes called an ostrich aster. These are different kinds of China asters. There were over 200 different kinds of asters in seed catalogs 100 years ago. And there was one seed company from New York that you could order from because we had good train service. You could order seeds from New York City. They had 103 different kinds of named asters in their seed catalog in 1 year. That tells me that a lot of people liked asters. And they're not really the most easy to grow plant. They're not that difficult, but they're not the easiest at all. So it tells me that not only did people like asters, it meant they liked a challenge, and they knew their plants, and they were good gardeners because they could grow a couple hundred different varieties of asters and make it worthwhile for the seed companies to sell them. I'll take you on a detour to the vegetable section. This is the vegetable section of the seed catalog, and these are, in fact, old seed packages. Every seed company didn't have their own seed packets. They would be contracted out sometimes to a printer, and every company might stamp their name on the bottom or something like that, but they were not branded. So you have kohlrabi and leek and lettuce, nice illustrations, lots of melons, more melons than I would know today. Mustard and nasturtiums and okra. Wait a minute, why is nasturtium in the vegetable section? And in fact, this is where it shows up in many seed catalogs. I'd say about half of the seed catalogs of the period had nasturtium in the vegetable section, and the other half had them in the flower section, where we would see them today. Because nasturtiums are completely edible. Every part of the nasturtium is edible. The flower, the leaf, the little seed pods, that's what you see at the top left, those can be pickled. And they have a spicy kind of flavor, very nice. So are they an edible flower, or are they an ornamental vegetable? And at this time, they were very popular in both ways, so much so that half the time they were thought of as vegetables and half the time as flowers. But they too were one of the most popular kinds of garden plants. They were available in bush sizes, as trailing, a kind of trailing habit. They were available in climbing format, like we see in the picture on the right. And they were also available by seed, by color. So you could buy yellow nasturtium separate from the others, and orange or red. Today you can only get, as far as I know, a mixed pack of nasturtium flower seeds. But back then we could find 26 different named varieties of nasturtiums by different colors. Not just yellow, orange, red, but salmon, salmon red, yellow salmon, brown and red stripes. There were just so many different kinds, all sold individually, separately, by name, because they were that popular. We also see a lot of sweet peas. Sweet peas were very, very fashionable. They were at first very popular in England because the sweet peas, that is, they really like to be not too hot, a little bit on the moist side, a little bit on the cool side. And as soon as they get too hot, they start to brown and fail. So they really like the temperature in England, and that made them very popular there. And that made them very popular here a little bit later on. We have also dozens and dozens of different kinds of sweet peas in old catalogs. And what happened to them all? How come we can't find 103 different kinds of asters in our seed catalogs today? And why aren't there 26 different colors of nasturtiums in our seed catalogs today. Part of it is a change in preference. I mentioned that asters are not the easiest plants to grow, and it may be that back then, when most people had grown up on a farm and knew their plants, they were willing to take on a challenge that most people aren't today. It is also definitely because of the two world wars. Before 1914, that's before the First World War, we see, like I said, hundreds of different kinds of asters. And by 1918, after the First World War, we only see maybe half of those. And we see the same loss in flower diversity between 1938 and 1945 during the Second World War. During those two periods, people were encouraged to plow up their flower gardens and plant vegetables for the war effort. It was called the Victory Garden movement. Plant vegetables, grow food for the war effort. And so there were a lot fewer people growing flowers, a lot fewer flower seeds were sold and produced during those two periods. And well, you can only imagine that in the seed warehouse, there would be all sorts of aster seeds that didn't get sold, sat on the shelf for 5 years or 6 years, and then were not viable anymore. They had not been contracted to be regrown because they were not in demand, and it takes 5 or 6 years for an aster seed to die out. Most aster seeds only live, in my experience, for about 3 years. And so after World War I, half of the aster varieties had just become extinct. And that happened again during World War II. So if anything, we had a much broader diversity and assortment and choice in flowers 100 years ago, well, no, 120 years ago, than we do now, for many reasons. And the consolidation of seed companies and the consolidation of how we market seeds had a lot to do with that as well. But we don't see as much of that loss in vegetables. For sure, we see a lot of loss of heritage varieties of vegetables, but not nearly as much as flowers. And I think the reason for that is that the vegetables were preserved during the two world wars, because that's what people were encouraged to grow. So we didn't see the loss of vegetables during that period like we saw flowers. This is how we know a lot from seed catalogs. And I've mentioned, a few times now, I've mentioned what we know from seed catalogs in 1914 versus 1918, or how many varieties of asters we can find in seed catalogs in the early 1900s. Here's one company that you might recognize. It's currently the biggest garden seed company in Canada. And they sold coast to coast back in 1908 as well. Their seed catalog at that time was, I think, 92 pages long, which is bigger than any seed catalog that I've seen today. And they sold annuals, they sold perennials. You could buy palm trees. They would come in on the train. You could buy roses, you could buy tools. They had farm equipment in their catalog. It was a really big company. And since we know that they marketed all these products all across the country, and that anyone could order them, and they would come in on the train and through the very good postal service that we had at the time, we know that all of these products were available to Canadians in 1908. Was it 1908? So that's how we know a lot about what you could get. Were these things affordable is another issue. See, these palm trees, they cost about $1.50, and you could get a really nice fern for about 30 to 70 cents, depending on how big it was. I know you can't read the print here too well, but those are the prices, and that sounds like a pretty good deal, $1.50 for a palm tree. But consider, in 1908, $1 was about what a working man would expect to earn in a day. That was about a day's wages. So when you put it into perspective that way, $1.50 is a lot of money. And that does not mean that just because you could order a palm tree and have it in your living room, that you necessarily would have a palm tree in your living room. We see lots of interesting different kinds of ornamental plants in these seed packages. Some of these names are very familiar today and some of them aren't. And of course the pictures are, they're hand-drawn, so I imagine there's a certain amount of fiction in how big they might look or how colorful they might look. We see some really nice mixture of perennials and annuals in here. And here's something kind of interesting. The one on the bottom, oh, actually, I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, the one on the bottom, right beside the nasturtiums, the musk plant. Have you ever heard of a musk plant? It was, if not the most popular garden and window box ornamental 100 years ago, then it was very, very close to it. Musk plant, it was usually sold as a window box kind of plant, something that you would put in a pot, put in on your porch. The reason is that it had an intense fragrance, a wonderful fragrance. They said that you could smell it from the road if it were planted on your porch. And it was popular. It was extremely popular. We know because it was sold in the Eaton's catalog. Do you remember the Eaton's catalog? Not everybody does, but the Eaton's catalog was the mass marketer of the time, that and the Sears Roebuck catalog. And they only sold the very, very most popular, most common things. If they sold plants and seeds, and they did, then you can be sure that they were the most popular varieties that you could get, or the most popular varieties that people bought. Musk plant was consistently sold by those big mass market catalogs who were not themselves seed companies. So about mid-1920s, around 1925, we start to read articles in horticultural magazines asking why the musk plant is losing its fragrance. Nobody could solve that mystery, but it seems to have happened uniformly everywhere. Musk plants, which were fabulously scented, were becoming unscented. Nobody knew the reason, nobody could reverse it, and before long, by the 1930s, musk plants were unscented. We may never know why. They are a plant known as the Mimulus moscatus. And if you look up the Mimulus moscatus, you will not find it. If you do, please tell me, because everybody thinks it's extinct. It was a wild plant that was originally from somewhere in Washington state. And that area where it was originally found has been paved over. As far as I know, there are no Mimulus moscatus in the wild and none in domestication. They don't exist anymore because the one thing that made them valuable was their fragrance, and they lost that. No one knows why. Maybe it was because it was interbred with other Mimulus, something like that. But regardless, the picture that you see here is of a plant called the Mimulus luteus, which is a relative that was always unscented. I grow it just so that I can show people what the Mimulus moscatus with the musk plant looked like, but you can never smell it. It just looks like this. So they love their nasturtiums, more nasturtiums, and more nasturtiums. Look at all the different colors of nasturtiums and sweet peas. Here's one that I really love. It's called a salpoglossus. It's also called velvet tongue or painted tongue sometimes. It grows much like a petunia. It's related to the petunia, and it is an annual. You grow from seed. You will probably not find it in a nursery. Every now and then I've been lucky to find it in a nursery, but mostly you can just get it from seed. And the reason is that there's no dwarf version of this. It's only a full-grown, about knee-high, 18-inch to 20-inch annual. And those kinds of plants that grow up to your knee, only bloom once they're about that tall. So if you buy salpoglossus in a nursery pack, it won't be in bloom, and it won't be in bloom for quite some time. It turns out that today, people don't really know what their plants are going to look like unless they see them right there in the nursery. And it's hard to sell nursery stock that isn't already in bloom. And that's why you won't find any tall plants in a nursery or annuals. You'll only find miniature, short, dwarf versions of annuals in nurseries today. Unless you have a very enlightened nursery locally that will sell some plants that will grow tall before they bloom. Otherwise, you have to grow yourself from seed. And if you look, you should be able to find Salpoglossus seeds, velvet tongue, painted tongue, wonderful annual. Look at all the colors that are in every bloom. Peonies, we have so many heritage peonies because peonies live for a long time. A lot of old farmhouses that had peonies planted around them 100 years ago, well, they still have peonies planted around them. And a lot of those peonies are 100 years old because they can just last that long. They are very long-lived plants. That means that collectors have gone around to all those farmhouses, collected all the old peonies, and many of our common everyday varieties of peonies are actually varieties that are 150 years old. And we can very easily plant these real pieces of history in our gardens. Very easy to find, very easy to grow. They smell wonderful. It's a lovely old-fashioned plant. Dahlias, the same thing. A lot of old varieties of dahlias have been around for a very long time. You generally dig up the roots and keep them indoors and plant them again the next year. So there's no seeds involved. You're keeping the plant going from year after year, and it's the same plant. And that means it doesn't change. It doesn't cross with other kinds of dahlias. You're literally just perpetuating the very same plant by bringing it indoors every winter. They're pretty easy to store. Enough people have done that we have lots and lots of old dahlias around. Bleeding Heart over on the right is a beautiful, delicate kind of plant, and that kind of delicate look, I think, goes a long way to creating an old-fashioned garden. We also look for tall plants, okay, plants that have some height to them. That makes a garden feel old-fashioned too. This is Cosmos, which you can get short, but you can also get tall. And if you were trying to make an old-fashioned kind of feel, tall Cosmos goes a long way to creating that kind of scale that feels like an old-fashioned plant. The reason is, like I said before, you couldn't get, you can't now today get tall annuals in nursery packs, only the dwarf ones. So we created all of those dwarf varieties during the last 100 years to serve the nursery industry. And so those dwarf varieties of all our annuals didn't exist 100 years ago. They were all the tall kinds, the tall zinnias, the tall Cosmos, long trailing petunias. All our modern compact bedding petunias, those are all pretty new. The old-fashioned petunias were long vines. Petunias are originally a vine from South America. They grow up the trees in the jungle. And we shortened them during the past century to make them nicely and well-behaved. And this tangle of colorful petunias, that's the old-fashioned look for petunias. Phlox, we have lots of nice old tall varieties of phlox. You know that in the last century there were a lot of new introductions of phlox that had difficulty with powdery mildew, and some newer varieties more recently that have resistance to powdery mildew. But in order to get that resistance, they went back to the old heritage varieties where they found that resistance in the first place. So heritage varieties of petunias don't necessarily have the same problems that the mid-20th century varieties do. We love our straw flowers. Straw flowers are an everlasting. It means that you can cut them and dry them, and they keep their shape and their color forever. They will dry nice and straight if you hang them upside down while they dry, and then make a floral arrangement that lasts all winter long. And that was really valuable for people who didn't have a lot of color in their lives in the winter. Houseplants, you would think of them as a winter plant. Maybe you bring your houseplants in the winter, but in fact, the windows on a lot of old houses were very small. And so they didn't want to put their houseplants on the windowsill. That would block the light. They would put their houseplants out on the porch more often, outside. And the houseplants are probably happier out on the porch where they get more sun. That leaves the windows unblocked. But in the wintertime, then you'd put the houseplants on the windowsill? No, because the houses were poorly heated and the windowsills were not well insulated, or windows weren't well sealed. So anything on the windowsill would freeze at night in the winter. So the houseplants had to be kinds that would be fine with low light. They would have to be in the interior of the house in the winter, and they would probably just go dormant in the low light. So tropical understory jungle plants were good choices for houseplants. And in fact, we use a lot of those today in our houses. Here are a couple of enterprising to a flower farm. I think a lot of people did this. There weren't the same kind of florists around. There were florists, but not to the extent that we think of it today. A lot of florist flowers were amateur grown, maybe sold through a store, but the flowers actually came from people's own backyards. And now I want to give a little bit of an idea of how you can make your garden feel like an old-fashioned garden. Use old-fashioned plants, that's sort of a giveaway, but it's more about the way you think about the scale of it. We talked about a more sort of larger scale, larger plants because they didn't have the dwarf plants. Well, that really makes a big difference. Tall plants like hollyhock, they kind of feel like they're a human size. And the big tall dahlias instead of little tiny dahlias, they kind of feel like they're a human size. And look what that does in the garden. When you have tall celosia, these red flowers, it makes it feel like an old-fashioned garden because the plants are something that you can relate to on your own scale. Instead of sort of walking above them and looking down at them down on like a carpet, they're up at your size. And that to me is the primary feel that an old-fashioned garden would have. So look for tall plants and create that kind of feel of walking through the plants instead of just walking over top of them. We see this also with all annuals. These are zinnias, nice tall zinnia. You won't be able to get bedding plants of tall zinnias that bloom 3 or 4 feet up off the ground. You'll only be able to get seeds. But zinnias are not hard to grow from seed. Give them a try and try the tall kind. Look in the seed catalog and find the ones that are 36 inches tall. You'll have to wait for them to bloom for a little while because they have to grow 36 inches before they bloom. But it's worth it. It's so worth it. Butterflies love these, and like little landing pads for butterflies.
Hi, Bob. I just want to say that we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, I'm just about done then. Thank you very much. Save your own seeds from the zinnias when they're dry and brown. You can collect them up. I will just show you one more slide that I think gives a really good overview of what an old-fashioned look is. We have a real focus on the height of the plants in the middle, and this island bed out in the middle of the yard gives a sense of the garden being a special thing. It's not just a decoration of the house; it is its own element. And this picture also kind of shows the building in the back does not have any foundation plantings, and so they actually they put their garden out in the middle of the yard instead of against the house, which I think you could do both, in fact. But having the garden out in the middle of the yard gives a stronger sense of its own separate value. And color, although this picture doesn't have any color in it, I always try to point out that people didn't have as much color in their lives as we do today. They didn't have screens to look at, and they didn't have brightly colored clothing like we do, or plastic. And so the old-fashioned color scheme, I think, being bright, bold, contrasting color, is something also that we wish that we could see in the pictures. They're all black and white pictures, but if you could colorize them, that's what they would look like. So I thank you very much. I realize that we're just almost at the end of the hour, and appreciate your time here today. And this has been a really fun Seedy Sunday for me.
Well, that's great. So I know that we've been kind of notating some questions, and we just want to make sure that we got them in before you left, or if you're welcome to stay for our last presentation. But Alexandra, did you have some questions that you had notated in the chat that you would like to ask Bob on behalf of everybody?
I did. So are there any plants in the myrtle family native to BC or Washington State?
That I'm very sorry that I don't know that. No, I'm in Ontario.
That's no problem. And do you recommend any specific heritage seeds? Sort of what are maybe the best ones adapted to our BC climate, specifically Lower Mainland?
My standard answer for that is always look for locally produced seeds. So you'll have seed companies that import their seeds from all around the world, and you'll have seed companies that grow their own. And just like with local food, you go to a farmer's market and you should be finding out which food was grown locally. Do the same thing with your seeds. Find out which seeds were grown locally, because those obviously will grow for you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Bob. I think we should probably end it there, but we really appreciate you taking the time to give us all that wonderful information. It was really neat to take a journey back in time, as you said. And yeah, I've got so much inspiration for my own garden, and I'm sure all our participants do as well. So I'll hand it over to Amanda. She is our next webinar participant. She's going to be talking about climate in our garden. So I'll hand it over to you, Amanda.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that we're all on, and again, we are recording, so just make sure you have your screen settings where you need it to be. So this presentation is on climate change and food systems in Canada. I know that this is always very different by municipality. I want to just start out with that. And climate change is always something that is a very complex topic. It's on our minds, and we're all very much concerned about it, especially since we've had the presentations that we've had today. So we already heard about the butterflies. That was also climate change was a nod to that, and why it's kind of detrimental. So the thing with climate is that we need to kind of define it, because this whole topic of climate change and food systems within Canada can be really broken down. And the screen that you're seeing right now is a floodplain and some flooding in Neepawa, Manitoba. And I just want to have everybody look at that screen and kind of think about what you might be thinking about that. It's quite an important thing. So while you're kind of taking a moment to pause and take a look at that screen that you're seeing right now, I want to also say that I do work for LEPS, the Langley Environmental Partner Society, and I am the Agricultural Stewardship Coordinator. And I just want to make sure that all of you kind of have some context in regards to growing food, because that is kind of one of the titles in this presentation is food systems. But we will be breaking that down a little bit more. But while it may be a very pretty view, that flooding there, it is detrimental to some degree, for sure. And as someone who did live in Manitoba at one point, this was quite a common sight. So I'm going to dive into just really what climate change and local food systems are. So I really want to make sure that we all kind of understand that climate change globally is happening. And when we think about the global aspect, we really should think about how it's affecting communities within those areas. Now, we've all heard about the polar vortex out in Texas, and it's damaging a lot of citrus fruits. we need to know that. And I know that the media is quite scary when it talks about climate change, and it is a science. And this particular, presentation will not talk about the science of it, because that is what is on the government of BC and the federal government websites, that we all have links to that. And I will share those links at the very end of this presentation. So we will not be talking about the science of climate change, but rather that the effects and how to mitigate and kind of adapt, really, because we need to be able to adapt. Now, climate change is varying. There are highs and lows to it, like everything out there. And I will go into that. So I want you guys to go into this with a very open mind, and it's going to change a lot of our growing aspects and how we kind of understand and mitigate, adapt, and go forward. So food systems is a really interesting piece because it can be explained in current day understandings, really with food growing and distributed via community kitchens, weaning projects, or it's simply the basic principle of getting food to people. That would be one level. But really the food system in Canada can be at a federal level with commodity crops. So we think about food grown in Canada. We have the wheat board, the dairy board. We even have within BC the Berry Association. There are more commodity crops within our country, but also we can be provincially guided and even municipally at our own city levels. So since we're talking about Seedy Saturdays and Seedy weekends across Canada, this is where we want to focus, because it would be about our backyards. It'll be about our community gardens, our balcony plantings. So I don't want you guys to be really concerned about this whole global aspect of it, because we can't control the whole polar vortex or even some of the other issues that we have. And I'm pretty sure as I go along to some of the other slides, you're going to sympathize with some of the aspects that we have going on. So all of our other presenters kind of had a bit of a bio kind of going ahead and introducing each one, or they did it within themselves. We didn't really have any bio for myself because I do work for LEPS, so I just want to put that out there. Some of you really don't know my background. If you don't, here we go. So yes, I do currently work for the Langley Environmental Partners Society, and that is in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, and I'm their agricultural stewardship coordinator. But within that role, I do educate youth and adults on gardening and food systems for our local school district, and I manage a teaching farm for public information and education. So that photo that you do see is not on any of that property in terms of schools, but I'll get into that. I also was a landscaper and a gardener for a botanical garden for 4 years. That was a 6-acre garden, and it was probably one of the most wonderful experiences I had, because it was a true teaching garden for anybody who is hands-on learning. I also worked with a fruit tree arborist for 3 years. I'm still in contact with him, so I'm very happy to say that I love fruit trees and I love to care for them. I will admit that. I'm one of the master gardeners of BC, and I was a farmer for 6 years at 4 different testing sites. First, the site that I was at, if you can kind of think about climate change and kind of the issues that are regarding it, whether it's drought or excessive rain or wet conditions, soggy, there are some sites that I can safely say that I had and I'm keeping with me through this whole time of horticulture and agriculture in my time now. So the first one had no irrigation and clay soil, and that is a bad combination. But somehow in my farm business, we did make money. We were profitable, whether that meant like digging carrots with pitchforks out of that clay soil, or just simply growing mesclun mix because that seems to do really well. We figured that piece out. My second site was full of irrigation and loamy soil. It was wonderful. It was we had leased land from a duck and goose farm. And we had all the manure that we could ever want. We had amended it. It was wonderful. We even had underground irrigation. But that can only last so long because my farming partners decided to move out to Ontario, and I had to give up that business. But my next site that you're going to be seeing photos from was full of shade, and it had sandy soil. So if anybody who is watching this, because it is being recorded, if you have shade and sand, it doesn't mean you can't grow. You just can't grow everything. But I had to figure out quite quickly what we could grow. And we operated a CSA program at that site. And believe it or not, it was quite challenging, I have to admit. We were watering all the time. We did have a water source at that site, but it was challenging. But the current site that I'm growing on now, and in terms of who's watching this already kind of knows, we are on a floodplain with no irrigation. So that means we're at our LEPS learning farm, and there will be some challenges there, and that's probably what I stay up late, kind of planning what I can plant. But it kind of mimics this whole thing about climate change. So that if you think about it, and we'll get into that in the next slide, what extremes climate change has in terms of sites, difficulties growing, and that's been probably the best hands-on education I could ever dream of, because now I'm growing for high school students, their cafeteria and food banks. And honestly, you can't be leasing an acre and a half or 5 acres and without being able to be profitable, because these people depend on you. So if you all kind of wonder about like where I came from, no, I did not graduate in horticulture. You would think I did, but I didn't. I have a BA in history from the University of Manitoba, so I did spend some good hard years out in Manitoba. But for fun, and anybody who is a plant lover, we always have other things that we do. We always do things when we have time. Some people, it could be beekeeping, it could be foraging, or for myself, I actually find it very relaxing doing floral design. So climate change as a review, because I think we need to break it down, because when we take a look at some of the news articles, we get a little bit anxious about climate change. Some of us do, some of us don't, but I want to just kind of review it a little bit. So climate is essentially prevailing weather conditions. What is happening around? What is happening around you right now? So where I am doing this live is out in Abbotsford, BC, and it is, I wouldn't say clear outside, but it's overcast, and we did have a little bit of rain. It's off and on. That is my prevailing weather condition right now. So it's not too extreme, it's kind of minor. But essentially climate change is the gradual warming of our global climate. We can't be thinking about our, our inside boxes where we are. It's globally, we're becoming warmer. And we do actually have extreme weather events. We didn't actually start getting these extreme weather prevailing events until really about 1996, or even further back, 1992. So I like to always piggyback, and I'm really happy that we had our 3 different predecessors doing their presentations, because this one piggybacks on all of them. So we could be having extreme hot and cold. And I know that if I was to track weather across Canada, we've all experienced extreme hot and cold, or we have experienced rain and drought, going back to that flooding screen. So whatever you think about climate change, always think that you're going to be having a few degrees higher in some days and a few degrees lower on shoulder seasons. But I want to say right now, in terms of climate change, and I'm going to say this comment just really within our Fraser Valley, within Langley, Abbotsford, Surrey, Chilliwack, even Vancouver. So we're talking more about weather within the Fraser Valley. We are having probably the most windiest spring we've ever had. And This is where we want to go into noticing what's happening around us all the time. I've never noticed this much wind, really. And it's something that we need to keep in mind, because if we think in the Fraser Valley, you know, everybody sees our climate and knows our climate, but it's not quite as easy peasy as what we think. So I want to go back to, this is probably the only screen I'm going to share in terms of temperature globally, because while we could be having tons of documents to state the actual legitimacy of climate change, that is what we want to refer to our wonderful township of Langley and also our provincial and federal governments, because they have great climate change action strategies with the science behind it in there. I only have 45 minutes, and this would take me probably about 3 days to talk about climate change and how to mitigate. So I'm going to fit this all as much as I can into 45 minutes or even less, let's hope. So the screen that you're seeing right now is the global temperature trend baseline. And there is that 0 mark that's right across, that would be right here. So if you were to take a baseline of 0, which would be the normal kind of base, there is a lot of history done on this about what would be the baseline. If you want to message me after and ask about where that came from, please do. But in 45 minutes, we don't have the time. So that's that baseline right here. That would be 0. And historically, the year is underneath. So we have 1880 to 2020. And we can take a look at this lovely little black line, because that shows where the dips and the valleys are in terms of kind of the average base, because again, we have little gray marks that notate temperature dips and increases. So while not every day is the same, that's what this graph proves not every day is the same. It is an average, of course, because this whole block here represents 20 years, but there is going to be an average taken. This is important to note. So whether or not we have something that's very, you know, mind grabbing to you at that moment, that's not the only instance that's happening. So I'll go back to that polar vortex out in Texas with the citrus fruits. That's historical data, which is found essentially on any kind of weather website that can be within BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. You need to go back to those sites, those weather sites, because they have historical data, and it will change by municipality and even by block. And we'll get into that in another slide. But I just wanted to see if you could understand really, and the chat can go ahead, and I know that Alexandra is monitoring that. I'm grateful for her, but you need to see where, yes, we are warming, and this is the whole trend, and I hope you understand that, yes, it is a concern. So in addition to global warming, yes, we are having a sea level rise, because I know that everybody is hearing news that the ice caps are slowly starting to melt. So that happens with global warming. Our oceans are being acidified. As more it rains, there could be some acidic nature within those rain pellets, and that's going into our ocean. There's other reasons for that, but that is for another presentation. And we are seeing across the board, there are wars over resources. But that's globally. We need to think about what's happening across Canada. So this presentation was made for the Seeds of Diversity to share amongst all of the communities within Canada. But we need to kind of think about, what does that mean for us? And I know we're going to focus on Langley, and we will focus on Langley as we go into the presentation, but we need to think about what is about Canada. So across the board, we are having heat waves. This can differ by municipality and by province, of course. As someone who did live in Manitoba for 5 years, it was hot, but I was in my early 30s, so I didn't really count or notate any of the temperature. But in BC, we have a humidex that we need to actually really measure, and we need to notate that humidex. Now, air quality issues, we think right here, well, we don't really have forest fires in our area, but we have the side effects of forest fires and all that smoke, because we do know from the news that we had a lot of damage in terms of fires in the Okanagan in the interior, and all of that smoke goes somewhere. Now, there also is flooding and drought. That's why I like to open up my front slide with flooding in Neepawa. That happens in BC, that happens in Alberta. We're not special, and everybody thinks we are in the Fraser Valley in BC because we have this great growing zone. We are still being affected by climate change. Now, the last thing on this slide is invasive plants and pests. And we'll go into that because that's more prevalent than anything else. Okay, now my coworker, Alexandra, knows my opinion on the plant hardiness zone and any growing zones that are notated on plants and even our planting guides. This is an example, very much like Michele had taken from the federal government website. It's very important to take a look at this map, and I'm gonna take some tea, and I want you guys to look at it and think about it more critically. So in our area, which is down here, and you can see my mouse, nice and orange. And if we go over to this guide right here, all of the orange is within 6B and 7B. This is an average. So there's a lot of gardening sites out there that will give you misinformation, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Depending on where you are in your natural environment, you can't go within a strict growing zone. And talking with my coworker Alexander yesterday, I had notated that any garden center across Canada, if you were to look at the plant labels, they're only going to provide for you what is going to be naturally growing within that area and according to your zone, but they will cheat a little bit. So they may, if you are, let's say someone, after we put this on our YouTube channel, there's someone in Saskatchewan that could be, maybe we see some green here. So anywhere between 3B and 3A and maybe a little bit 4 as we get a little bit more south. Those garden centers could actually carry plants that could be maybe a zone 5. And so if we think about zones, the smaller the number, the colder it is. The higher the number, the warmer it is. So this is all about temperature and to some degree humidity, but it's an average. It's not an absolute. So people are always looking at this map and like they want to know the updated like plant hardiness zone for their area, but it's going to change. And that's what climate change is. So you cannot anymore look at a map with a plant hardiness zone and think automatically that that's my zone. That's important to know. I know that I would talk about this a little bit more, and in the chat, you guys can ask questions, or Alexandra can hammer away at me if you want to message her directly, so feel free. But that plant hardiness zone, I kind of want you to put that on the back burner a little bit, because knowing if you can go to Arts Nursery, Cedar Rim, any of these nurseries in our area, they're only going to have plants that are made for our growing zone, but they will cheat a little bit. And I will say right now, I have a Fatsia on my balcony that is a zone 10. So we're talking about tropical, really warm. In our cold snap for 3 days, I brought it in because it was shrinking and wilting, but it's outside right now, and that's zone 10. So think about what you have in your areas And this is a whole lot of information, and it's not even just mostly information, but it's going to be a lot of accountability in terms of notating the changing environment that you're in. Which leads me to my next screen, microclimates. So this is what goes completely against that whole thing about growing zones, is that if we're in the township of Langley, we will think about Surrey, Walnut Grove, Brookswood, Aldergrove, Abbotsford, close to the border. We will really change within about a whole climate number or a half a climate number. That's why there's 6A and 6B, 7A, 7B. But I want to say that climates are very different. So climates are really, like those microclimates are an area that has diverse plants to encourage beneficial insects or animals to reside and have an established water resource for everyone. That includes the insects, the animals, and to some degree the people. So you want to have diversity. You want to have different plants. And that goes according to, really, if you think about Michelle's presentation, that piggybacks on all of this, is diversity is very important. And even some degree Bob's presentation. But growing zones, they will change. So I really want to say, like, if you are a new gardener, you need to kind of think about, like, take some time and pause, because we always want these resources. And I'm going to give you some resources at the end of this presentation for you to go to. But when you go to the computer and Google your growing zone, you may have some challenges, and we're going to get into it because it's all about the individual landscapes, and especially areas that contain valleys or uneven ground. And we say this even kind of at the bottom here. So hedges, trees, shrubs, fences, homes, or buildings can affect your growing zone, but also affect your microclimate. And again, I notated that unevenness of land. So we think about climate change and those unexpected activities that happen weather-wise. I have a direct photo of this, and there's two different photos on each end of the screen. On the, well, if you're looking at your screen, that would be the right side. We have a beautiful, lush green garden. There's anywhere from garlic, beets, there's some potatoes, nasturtiums, and a wonderful, back here, butternut squash growing on this kind of fence / trellis. But in 2014, there was a massive windstorm, and it was probably the most devastating damage-wise wind system that came in, and all of these alder trees. And that LEPS doesn't really like alders, and I understand why, because of this damage specifically. These are all alder trees that came down. So this right on the right side, that green garden actually is tucked back here. And it was devastated by all of these trees. So we have a gardener here, her name is Brenda. She was one of the ones that were having to clean out that woody debris, and that took her and a team of 5 people 3 days. So we think, and a lot of people in Canada think that we don't really notate climate change. Climate change is going to be different by province and by area, for sure. Some of that is actually going back to that hardiness zone, because we really don't know. Like, some of us are cold, we don't experience the same things, but us warm people out here, that's a bit of a problem. And I will say that right now, that windstorm that happened, that was this devastating, happened in the month of August. So anything can happen at any time. And that's where I kind of go back to, you can't have a black and white manual that tells you what to plant and when, and how it's going to grow and how your yield will be. It's always going to be variable. That might be something that not people want to hear or admit, but climate change is about Mother Nature. And that's why on my bio screen, my Mother Nature background. I can't control what I'm growing. I have to adapt to Mother Nature, what my area is, and what I'm growing. So I have a great balcony. I'm not going to show you photos of that, but I have wonderful plants that are blooming right now. My creeping Jenny is coming back. The Fatsia is out there and doing well, but this is where we need to kind of think about our areas and where we're growing, because you cannot get away from climate change, but that's not to be a scary thing. Again, that Fatsia is zone 10. We, on average, across the Fraser Valley are around a zone 7 as an average. So we can't really complain that much, but we need to be able to observe. So edible plants, because we are talking about community gardens, we're talking about small farms, we're talking about balcony gardens. Sudden weather changes does have an effect on our edible plants, because we can get delayed growth, dieback, wilting, early frosts, plant decomposition, and breaking branches. And so the photo that you actually see on the screen right now is a romaine leaf that was taken in northern BC, and that kind of damage here that you see in brown is all frost damage in August. So things are going to happen, and we just have to prepare for it. And I think that's kind of the main message today, is prepare for it. Don't think that it's going to really wreak havoc on everything. Like, you know, tulips are blooming in the Fraser Valley. I have my first tulip blooming right now because I'm in a shady kind of composition with my front balcony, but my tulips are blooming. Doesn't mean your plants won't grow. They just may be delayed, decompose, and you can restart. But I want you guys to know that these are mostly edible plants, are going to be annuals. We will be having berry plants, fruit trees, absolutely, but most of our veggies and fruits are annuals. When we have damage that is delayed, if we have the worst May, we've never actually really had a bad May, but if we do have a bad May and we have some cool temperatures, we may have some really, really delayed growth and very small yields. But in terms of, you know, fall crops, there's one thing that I need to say is that our seed companies, they're very busy. And this goes to this point at the very bottom here. We have a local seed company that, you know, puts out magazines and a growing guide, and it hasn't changed that growing guide for the first frost date in about 2 years. So that's kind of important to know. We don't have anything really that is absolute, and growing guides are guides. They're not absolute. This is one thing that you need to know. So November 4th for the first frost date. I'm sure that all of you, wherever you are, if you're tuning in at a farm or a balcony or a backyard garden or community garden, frost dates are always going to be different. So please take those growing guides by seed companies as a guide, but we're going to get into the next slide. My computer wants to let me go. And this is where, you know, we have technical difficulties. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to reshare. I'll go to the screen that we're going to go to. Okay, so this is my next screen. Adaption is key. It's really key. So knowing that you guys can change your microclimate and your effect in terms of warmth, amount of water, you need to know it, because we can't be broadcasting across the board and having an average of like, oh, Abbotsford, you are zone B, Langley, you're zone A. We can't do that. So I want to have you guys get away from the growing zone map and start to kind of think about your own areas, whether that means you need to think about weather. It's the windiest it's ever been. I've never had this much wind in the first 3 to 4 months of the year. It's very breezy. That can come at a bad thing, because that can, extrapolate moisture out of plants and the leaves, but also it creates airflow. So it's kind of a catch-22. But the one thing that I want you guys to do is try to keep a garden log. This has come across, all the talks in Canada that I've done so far, that people have never done this before. Now, this one that you're seeing right here is from Lee Valley. I love it because it has the year, and you can take this whole thing about asparagus, and that is a whole page on asparagus, and it's the year, and you can write the high and the low. You can write notes in here, especially when there are extreme weather events. And it can be a whole page on asparagus. And the thing is that this whole thing, this particular book here, can last for 10 years. And just include everything you can, because the one thing that we don't do enough as gardeners is to write things down. And I know that Dan had mentioned this already in his talk about starting seedlings indoors. He mentioned this too. So we're all on the right track in terms of speakers and what we find very valuable, but it's important to write things down. I still have in my office at LEPS a paper, because I made sure that I wrote it down, from 2013 about what the average was in terms of weather and the first frost date. Very important. So include everything. And when you come into like the weather network, they'll always tell you, especially what's current, wind rates. Really note that too. Also choose short season crops, because you really don't know how the weather is going to go, and that's kind of the fun about it. So please don't take it as something that's kind of scary. We just have to roll with it. So just be adventurous with your crops and look at the seed packs in terms of maturity dates. Also, one thing you may want to keep in mind, knowing that we had a massive windstorm in 2014, try to kind of consider plants that don't require a lot of trellising or staking. That could be potatoes, well, not really potatoes, but tomatoes and beans. That's a big thing. So there are indeterminate and determinate tomatoes. A lot of the bushy ones that are determinate, they will stay nice and bushy, a little bit more wider, and they'll require that kind of cage staking. That might be something, because I have seen in regards to that picture, that might be one plot I took a photo of, but the whole trellis kind of came down on the intermittent tomatoes that are outside. But also choose seeds according to your region. So I know that Dan had mentioned this, and Michele as well, somehow sneaked into her message, but according to your region. We're in BC. I know that we have our favorite seed company, but we want to kind of still adapt, and that's what Seedy Saturdays are for. We support a lot of seed companies that are saving local seed, and that could be from Naramata, that can be from Salt Spring, Early Bird Family Farm, anybody who's on our spreadsheet, that's important, but try to choose seeds according to your region. They'll be a bit more resilient. So planning and observing is the major key that goes back to the 2 slides before about how you want to write things down, and sit outside with a cup of tea or coffee and just make sure you really observe what's happening outside, because it will be different according to your microclimate. And for people who don't know what a microclimate is, feel free to email me. I think I'm going to be finishing on time, so we can still talk about that piece as well. But make sure you always observe. So try to plant seedlings as much as possible to establish a root system. Direct seeding is wonderful, but try to play around with it, because I know that I have a farmer or two that is tuning in right now, and beets, spinach, even carrots can still do well transplanted. I know that if you go in a book, someone's gonna have an opinion on that. They would prefer to be direct seeded, and yes, they do, but that doesn't mean you can't kind of swerve around that and do a seedling. Also about water collection, if you're on a site or you have water restrictions, and water restrictions will always come within our watersheds, try to get a collection system, because there is nothing bad about collecting rainwater, filtering it, and using it in your garden. But also when it comes to your garden, please look at it. This is the important part, is sometimes we just plant stuff and we don't come back, and then we see it and we wonder what happened. Now, this is where, if you plant a garden, you deal with it and you watch it and you come back and you nurture it, you care for it, and you water it. But look at your plants for bugs. So bugs love humid, warm winters that can survive cold temperature dips, especially when it returns to a warmer temperature. And we see that right now in the Fraser Valley. It will rain, be quite cool. Like, it rained the last couple days, and I was outside with our learning farm students, and it was shivering. But then all of a sudden the sun broke, and all of a sudden it was warm. That is what kind of pests and diseases really like. It likes that kind of weird kind of temperature mix, but you need to watch your plants if that weather happens. Now, in terms of insects, some of you guys already know aphids. You've seen wireworms to some degree, and if you don't know what a wireworm is, that's kind of like that little orange short worm. They love this temperature. They love it. We've actually had potato crops devastated in Delta because of the wireworms. But if you see any sightings of bugs that you're not really aware of, our local agriculture branch in Abbotsford, I know that you think Abbotsford very far away if you're viewing from Surrey, this presentation, or Langley. They actually have people on staff that will take a look at that sample of that bug, and they will ID it for you, and they will track it. And if it's concern across the Fraser Valley, they will make it a call out for people to observe it. But the major thing, and we've mentioned, I know that Dan mentioned this before, that soil is very important. I know that I had watched a presentation, many presentations, as all of you guys probably have done, and I have a site that I'll mention to you, which is Pinch of Soil. They're at kind of a no-till farm. You want to make sure that you invest in soils that hold the moisture. No one wants to be out there watering very much. Because some of us might have really reserved water supply. So get soils that hold moisture. And the Derek Doubleday Learning Farm is going to be an example of that, because I don't have irrigation there. It's great soil that we're trucking in, but I don't have water available to me anytime. I can't put a sprinkler on it or a hose and water my plants. But moisture held in the soil is going to be important. So if you can get a hold of any soil books or Zoom material about soil, very important. But I also want you to spread the word. We're rounding out to 12:42 and we're finished at 1, so I'm good on my time. Spreading the word and getting out there and connecting with our local communities is probably the most important thing. That photo that you see is me in a nature's classroom talking about compost and soil, and everybody seems to be quite engaged as you see the back of their heads and they're all looking ahead. But it's very important that we do that. So try to work with your local schools. Today in our presentations, we already had a school teacher, and we did have other people trying to encourage the engagement of our local communities, but that starts with our youth. And yes, we want to plant gardens at our schools, absolutely. And I know Michele will agree with me. There's also garden clubs out there, and you can talk with fellow gardeners, because it's not all about our balcony gardening, but it's about spreading the word, because I remember in my old complex that I was living in, everybody saw me trying all these plants and food and vegetables and fruits. And I noticed that about 4 people in the back that was close to my car, they all had plants in their window after a while, and I'm quite happy with that. But also try to encourage. Biodiversity is very important when it comes to climate change. And farmers institutes are really important. If you find that you have one in your area, try to engage with them. Every Farmers Institute will be very different, community-based, policy-based, but if they're community-based, try to engage with them because they may be able to fill in that void if there's not a garden club, if there's not another environmental organization that I'm a part of, very important. And also, lastly, to which everybody who is a presenter today will agree with, is try to engage in seed saving. It will be very difficult once we kind of figure out about how to seed save and what the requirements are and how we can kind of think about true seed. That's Bob's area that he did a presentation already on, and we may have him back on another one about seed saving. But engage with us at agriculture@leps.bca to figure out how to save your seed and engage in Seedy Saturday and Sunday events. But no matter what the weather is, forge ahead. We're going to have dips in weather wherever we are. And that's something that we need to kind of keep in mind. Summers and winters probably will not always be the same. They may be really hot or a little bit on the cool side, but always plan ahead. And if that can mean prevention, great. Road cover, greenhouses, that's always a great question. But I have notated here at the bottom that that's my email if you have any questions, because trying to put in a 45-minute presentation about climate change is very tricky. I hope my takeaway was more or less about the growing zones and kind of how not to divert strictly to them, but just sort of observe and feel your way through. I know this is going to be tricky for a lot of new gardeners, but ones that are trying to mitigate and finding challenges about their regular pattern, this topic may be more important. But I just want you guys to just make sure that you are informed. This website right here at the very bottom is the environmental website for the Government of Canada, and they will tell you all about climate change science, and that's where I want to make sure that I steer you to the right path, but we need to mitigate and adapt, really. So I'm going to end my presentation there. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and if there's any questions, because I know I hit on a few topics. I don't know if I have some questions.
I'm going to jump in, Amanda. Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. I think we can all agree that this is a topic that's affecting everyone, and it will be continued to be discussed for many years. I did have one question. I wondered if you could speak briefly about how important it is to plant native plants in our garden to help mitigate the climate change effects.
Well, a lot of our native plants are drought tolerant. So if we think about what you can grow in our area, that can be anywhere between thimbleberry, salmonberry. It's nice because drought tolerant plants are kind of the way forward, and they tend to be native, and they are attractors to pollinators. And that helps create our biodiversity. I know that's quite simple the way I state it, but with all of those factors in mind, that's kind of why I would, because at our learning farm, we have all of our hedgerows all about native plants. And not only is that a hedgerow, a windbreak, but it also, they're native, and we'll have wonderful pollinators attached to it. And I don't have to water them all the time.
All right, so if anybody has any other questions, you can write them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. We'll just give a few more minutes to any questions, so please do that now.
It's nice to see, though, that there are comments in this chat regarding some observations about different weather patterns. And yes, there are strong wind events. It's just windy overall. And I know that that's the one thing is that we always think, oh, well, we're in a wonderful growing zone, but we still have a lot of damage to our plants. And yes, the amount of rainfall has increased. Thank you, Diana. And we need to figure out what we really can do about our watersheds and protecting them, because yeah, the septic fields are important. And yeah, South Surrey, bit of a difference. So we have to think about where we are. And I really want to make sure that you guys start observing and writing down patterns, because that note I have in my office on my clipboard, that number is different now. And that was an average of years ago. And that's kind of the important part of all of this is you can change by growing zone. It's not an absolute science. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's very important to just track it and be present. And if that takes another 5 minutes of your day, it's warranted.
Right, well, if we don't have any more questions, I think we can probably end the session a little bit early, but thanks so much, Amanda. I know that we talk about this often in the office, and I always love hearing your thoughts about the growing zones. So thank you to all of our presenters today. I think all of us can agree we've had a wonderful Sunday morning learning about lots of different topics. And it's great that we could still have a seedy weekend despite COVID. I think we adapted quite well. So I hope everyone's enjoyed it. And then, as Amanda mentioned, if you do have any other questions or comments, please email her. And we hope that we can do an in-person event next year. But for now, happy second day of spring, and hopefully the weather improves and we can get out in our own gardens. Thanks, everyone. Bye.